Quick disclaimer, this video is a compilation of multiple videos over multiple years, with the occasional new segment altered or added here and there. Please be mindful of varying audio and video and script qualities. Also note that the Xenoblade segments look like the games run very poorly, because I had to emulate them as I didn't have the means to record from my Switch directly at the time. As of me writing this, I have recently completed Xenoblade Chronicles 3's DLC campaign, Future Redeemed. Thanks to this, I'm finally capable of doing something that I've wanted to do for at least a year now. More specifically, since Xenoblade 3 was first announced. And I don't think there's any better time than this. The Xeno, or as I'll continue to call it from this point onwards, Perfect Works franchise is one of my favorite series of all time. I've been following it for more than a decade now, and it's finally reached a sort of conclusion. So I'm dedicating the next few videos to it. This will be an all-inclusive look at every single piece of media in the series that I find interesting, that isn't some sort of miscellaneous merchandise like figurines or keychains. From games to manga and anime, to even weird books that were released at some point somewhere in the world. I would like to clarify up front that these videos will be kept entirely spoiler-free for the most part, with spoiler sections being warned of beforehand. In that vein, I'd also like to ask you, the person watching this, to withhold from making comments that would spoil something for potential new players. I won't make any false promises, so I'll be as blunt as possible. These videos will not be an analysis or dissection of the stories that the series tells. That's not what I'm interested in, and plenty of others have done that before me, and better than I ever could, so I really don't want to do that. These videos will be purely about my opinion on these games and trying to dissect why I find them to be worth playing, as well as their corresponding side materials. With all of that said, I welcome you to Xenogears. Many words could be used to describe Xenogears. Mechanically broken and blatantly unfinished don't even begin to describe the extent of this game's issues. And yet it is my favorite game on the PlayStation. I assume that if you're watching this, you're at least tangentially familiar with the story behind Xenogears' creation, but in case you aren't, here's a little refresher. Since I find the story of the developers just as, if not more interesting, than the story of the games themselves. Xenogears was originally conceived as a potential pitch for Final Fantasy VII, conceived by one Tetsuya Takahashi and his wife, Kaori Tanaka, better known by her pen name Soraya Saga, who had previously worked as the graphics director for Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. Needless to say, Square Enix said fuck that and told him that the story would be too dark and complicated for a fantasy, which is kind of ironic considering that FF7 is a sci-fi dystopia about bioterrorism, but I digress. They did however give him the okay to turn it into a standalone project. The game entered development as Project Noah, a title that's going to be relevant again approximately 2 videos from now. They thought about making it a Chrono Trigger sequel at first, but that idea quickly went nowhere, so the original IP Xenogears was born. Takahashi himself would serve as the project's director and as one of its writers, alongside his wife and Chrono Trigger writer Masaru Kato. Originally, Takahashi wished for Tetsuya Nomura to be appointed as the project's character designer, however, he was busy working on FF7 at the time, so Kunihiko Tanaka got that role instead. A decision I am very thankful for, considering what would end up happening almost 20 years later. The reason why I'm mentioning all of these developers in particular is because of their involvement later on in the series' history. The same goes for the composer, Yasunori Mitsuda, whom I'll talk about more later on. After approximately 2 years in development, Xenogears was finally released in 1998, so it's about time I start talking about the game itself, beginning with the gameplay. Unlike the later Xenoblade games, Xenogears follows the same structure as most of Squaresoft's other RPGs at the time. Exploration is primarily split into 3 segments. You've got the towns and bases, where you just walk around, talk to NPCs, upgrade your equipment, etc. The second is the overworld, where you travel from the village of Schützburg to the capital of, I don't fucking know, Romania, or wherever else your next objective is. Where you then enter a dungeon, which is where most of your time playing will take place. The dungeons themselves are never too bad, barring the final one, which we don't talk about. The gimmicks are usually either pretty simple to figure out or borderline non-existent, so it's usually just a matter of finding the right path to progress forward. But there are issues, and all of them stem from the camera. Because of the semi-isometric nature of the game, it's pretty easy to lose your orientation, especially early on. The game has no mini-map to speak of, so the only thing you get to reorient yourself is a compass. Once you get used to it, finding your way around is honestly pretty simple, as the dungeon layout is never that complex. But unfortunately, that is not the only hurdle keeping many people from giving this game a fair shake. You can probably guess already, but The real issue is the random encounters, because there are a lot of them. Sometimes it feels like you can't even take 5 steps without being thrust into an encounter. I don't mind this, as I tend to play a lot of older RPGs, so high encounter rates really don't bother me, and I do think that by the time you're halfway through the game, you'll have gotten used to them. Know what I can't get used to though? Random encounters while platforming. At several points in the game, you'll be thrust into a platforming section, which is bad enough as is for an RPG. However, they don't disable encounters during them, making for some extremely frustrating sections. Encounters don't start whilst you're midair. However, it's not uncommon for an encounter to start the second you even touch the ground, making you fall off or barely miss. It is infuriating and happens way more often than it should. This is especially annoying because the movement when jumping just feels really off. It's got this weird delay and weight to it that makes it more irritating than it needs to be. I know that it's hard to visualize and probably not noticeable in the footage, so you'll just have to take my word for it. It can get pretty annoying. This is only made worse by the fact that load times in the game are really fucking annoying. Opening and closing the menu or entering a room takes way more than it reasonably should, and it can get pretty irritating. I grew used to it after a while, but I can't speak for everyone. And since we're already on the subject, let's talk about combat. First, let's talk about the on-foot battles. Fundamentally, it's like any other turn-based RPG. Every character takes turns attacking until a party with less health dies. Where it gets interesting is how Xenogears tries to deviate from the formula. The way magic works in this game is just about the only thing it has in common with, say, Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. You pick a spell and the enemy spontaneously combust. Everything else, however, functions off a rather unique system. Each time you attack, you can choose one of 3 attack types corresponding to the face buttons. Each of them uses a different amount of action points. You can then chain as many attacks together as you have AP. This is where the mechanic of the game, the death blows, comes into play. Every time you use a certain combination, you slowly build up experience on that combination. And once you fill it up to 100 and reach a certain level, you unlock a corresponding death blow. Now, every time you use that specific string of attacks, you ended off with an extremely powerful special attack. If you end up using one that leaves some AP over, they get stored in an additional meter, where you can then use them to chain multiple death blows together. Essentially, it works like this. Say you want to chain together a 4 AP, a 5 AP, and a 6 AP death blow. Then you'll need to have at least 15 leftover AP stored, so you can do that. It's an extremely cool system, but it comes with a massive caveat. Getting those death blows is a giant pain in the ass. The ideal way to go about it is to always do the combination that levels up the highest tier death blow you could theoretically do with your current amount of max AP. This will ensure that you automatically unlock it the second you reach the necessary level. At the same time, it also slowly levels up every single death blow below it. The reason why this sucks is that doing this prevents you from actively using your strongest moves, which causes regular encounters to feel like they go on forever. I've seen a lot of people call the game ridiculously grindy because of that, and honestly, I can't agree. It's not grindy at all. If you just fight the enemies as they come, then you'll be just fine no matter what, because the game is just insultingly easy. The issue is that the people who complain about grinding are usually the ones who try to get as many death blows as they can as soon as they're available. I can see why some would try to do that, but let's be honest for a second here. You seriously don't need that shit. As soon as you get used to the frequent random encounters and realize that you don't need every death blow, the game becomes significantly more enjoyable. Unfortunately, that comes with a problem of its own: the gear battles. Yeah, it's about time I mentioned them, considering they're a part of the title. Before I get into how they tie into the on-foot death blows, let me quickly explain how they work in general. So now and again, you'll be thrust into situations where you'll be piloting your gear. In the overworld, this changes nothing whatsoever. Combat, on the other hand, changes quite a bit. You can summon your gears while on foot too, but that only applies to certain areas and doesn't include bosses, so it's kind of pointless. Because the biggest change made is that the gears run on fuel. Every single attack uses fuel, and the only way to effectively refill it is at dedicated gear shops, where you can also buy new parts to upgrade them even further, which is the only way to improve their stats, making grinding XP for them a pointless struggle. The way death blows work also changes. All gear death blows consist of just 2 buttons. To use them, you first have to raise your gear's attack level, which you do after unlocking them. Attacking once gets you to level 1, then 2, then 3, and finally level infinity, which consists of only a single button input. And this is where it ties into the on-foot combat, because to unlock more gear death blows, you need to unlock on-foot ones of the respective character. And that's why not actively grinding out death blows can become a pain in the ass, because most major story battles, as well as the entire endgame, consist exclusively of gear battles, making them significantly more important than regular characters. Another issue with the combat for both is that it frankly is fucking broken. If you equip an E for double or an Ellie, you become strong enough to insta-kill almost any boss ahead of you, and Citan is simply just broken beyond belief, having ridiculously high speed stats and an insane damage output, paired with the ability to heal. Not using him is like actively handicapping yourself. Now, that's it for regular gameplay, however there is an entire dedicated fighting game mode, which is the central part of one of the story's arcs. It plays extremely janky, but is very cool for the time, even letting you set the maximum amount of FPS you want. I honestly think you'd have a harder time losing these battles than winning them, but I just wanted to mention them because they're cool. And it's an awesome showcase of what the engine was capable of. And in case you're wondering what the weight system does, nothing. It never affects you. It's an unused mechanic that does not affect anything, so it literally does not matter. That's all for the gameplay though, so let's talk about one of my favorite things about this game, the music. The music was composed by Yasunori Mitsuda. This man is an absolute legend, and despite this being one of his earliest projects, being his first major work since Chrono Trigger in '95, this is, in my humble opinion, his magnum opus. This soundtrack, much like everything else in the game, forms the basis of everything Xeno would end up becoming. The compositions take heavily from Irish, in particular Celtic, music. These instruments are a staple and a part of every Mitsuda-composed Xeno soundtrack, and even find themselves in the games where he wasn't involved in. Though we'll talk about that once we get around to it. Every single song in the OST is wonderful, perfectly complementing each situation, from the fantastic battle themes to the moody dungeon tracks. Furthermore, there are also 2 vocal tracks in the game, kinda. One of them went unused, being a vocal rendition of the world map theme. The other song, however, marks the beginning of a tradition with every single Xeno game. The credits themes are always vocal tracks, and the lyrics are always written by Takahashi himself. Joanne Hogg, the singer for these songs specifically, would end up doing the same for Xenosaga 1's credits theme, after which she took a break from the series. Though she did miraculously come back for there were also 2 special arrangement albums released for the soundtrack. One of them was wherein the music was arranged by the Millennial Fair Musical Ensemble. The other one was an album called Myth, the Xenogears orchestral album, which was not made by Irish people, but instead by Bulgarians? Joanne Hogg's still there though. Yeah, that's all I have to say about the music, let's get back on track. I promised not to spoil anything, so I'll keep this section brief. The story is the one thing that's going to keep you going. If you're here for the gameplay, then you'll be very disappointed. Naturally, the story needs to be extremely captivating to justify this, and I'm extremely happy to be able to say that it is. Shit gets going within the first minute of the game. I find the opening to be fucking genius. You're thrust into this fascinating sequence showing you the destruction of this gigantic spaceship, only to be pulled away from that scenario entirely and brought to the small village life of Fei Fong Long, where shit gets going within 15 to 20 minutes of play. The game is really good at keeping things interesting at every turn. I'll get more into this later in the spoiler section, but the Lahan village segment is quite possibly one of my favorite openings to any video game. And because of this, it pains me to say that as well as the game manages to pull you in and keep you interested, the second major arc in the game is an insanely tedious slog that goes on for far too long and has little payoff for the characters. Remember the fighting minigame I mentioned earlier? This is where it comes into play. It's just one fight after another, followed by a dogshit dungeon with easily the worst boss in the game, as he can insta-kill your party members. Something even the final boss can't do, only to be returned to some fighting until you're finally allowed to leave. This entire story segment just kills the pace, and while it serves as a neat bit of world building, it should not have gone on as long as it did. Thankfully, the story does pick up again right after this, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone decided they've had enough at this point and just drop it. Another issue is the characters. It's not that they're bad, quite the opposite. Everything in the story, including the characters, serves as the fundamental structure of every single Perfect Works game going forward. The story structure and personality archetypes are all established right here. I'll go into the character-specific parallels in the later games once I get to those respective games, but since we're here, let's establish the general archetypes without going into spoilers. We can do so later. There's always a peace-loving protagonist who fights to protect the people he cares about, who also suffers from some very clear mental health problems, their emotional counterpart who is also just as psychologically screwed, the man who knows a little bit more about the world than most do, and also wields a katana, the hot-headed bronze of the party, the machine life form, the teenager with a firearm, the Furby, the always composed strong guy with a heart of gold and some serious trauma to process, and lastly, the little girl with daddy issues. I've heavily simplified them, and the parallels in later games are never always one-to-one, with their roles and even designs often being shuffled around and given to multiple characters at once. In this game, unfortunately, multiple party members just kind of stop existing after the arc ends. Riku and Maria could be written out of the story entirely, and would barely change, and Emeralda doesn't get relevant until an endgame side quest. And then of course there's the biggest problem with the game's story, Disc 2. I realize that I'm probably making it sound like the story falls apart at this point, but the issue is actually quite the opposite. Sometime during development, the team had their development time cut dramatically, forcing them to turn Disc 2 into a rush job. In order to not sacrifice everything they had planned for the story, the team decided to put their focus on it rather than the gameplay, and because of this, Disc 2 largely consists of expository cutscenes in which the characters sit down in a chair and just tell you what's happening. Is it extremely funny and iconic? Yes. But it's also a damn shame. But you should pay attention, and you should keep going, because this too is also where the many mysteries of the game finally start unraveling. Because the story is something truly special, and there has never been anything quite like it. Well, barring later Perfect Works games, but you get the idea. If anything in this video so far has seemed in any way interesting to you, and you still haven't done so, then I implore you to go and play this game right now. It's absolutely worth your time, even if you may not feel like it at first. But stick with it, and you won't regret it. Everything from the world itself to its intricate backstory is meticulously written, and I want to give a massive shout out to the absolute legend, Richard Honeywood, who is the man behind the localization. Is it perfect? Fuck no. In fact, it's full of weird phrases like, "my dad, you mean my father?" and "sorry Dory." But I won't lie, I think there's a very distinct charm to having Faye say stupid shit like "scrumdiddlyumptious," and considering the fact that he had to dumb down the religious subtext without distilling the point too much, and took care of nearly the entire project entirely by himself, I cannot help but be impressed. It's also worth noting that he even had an impact on the story as a whole, proposing a name change that ended up being beneficial to the story in the grand scheme of things. So it's not like he made any changes without the approval of the original team either. In spite of all of this, the game still ended up selling extremely well, having shipped 1.19 million copies worldwide, despite never having been released in Europe. This would remain the highest grossing game in the franchise until Xenoblade 2, and that's fucking insane if you ask me. But going back to the story, I don't think anything encapsulates why I love this game's plots as much as I do as one of its main antagonists. Grahf is one of my favorite antagonists out of any RPG, and he functions as a perfect foil to the party. Much like the protagonists, the villains also serve as a basis for archetypes later on in the series. I'll get into this more in the spoiler segment, so for now let's just stick to Grahf specifically. He's a very prominent force throughout the story, and all of his appearances are extremely memorable. He always shows up when you least expect him to, and right until the end his allegiances are never clear, making you second guess his every move. And hell, I'd argue that his introduction is one of the three most iconic things in the game. He says this line every single time he shows up to make sure you remember it. The very first time he shows up, he randomly talks about wanting to kill God, throws a giant butt-plug dragon at you and fucks off. And if you don't think that's fucking awesome, then I don't think we can be friends. And since we're already talking about characters, I'm legally obligated to mention the best one. Big Joe. Big Joe is everywhere in the game, and he is fucking epic. It is Joe time, he loves Amor time, do not interrupt his Amor time, because the card game in this game is fucking bullshit. The next segment will contain spoilers, so if you still haven't played Xenogears, then please skip to the next segment or to this timestamp on screen. For everyone else, this segment will just be me discussing the antagonists and some of the main cast as well as my favorite moments in the game. One of my favorite things about these characters is how fundamentally flawed they are. Not just due to their clear psychological damage, but just as people. Faye's personality is fake, and whilst it is a manifestation of all his hate and suffering, when you look at him in past incarnations, a very clear image of self-righteousness and arrogance is painted. Kim Kasim especially shows a version of him where those ideas are so prevalent to the point where he ends up presenting the world around him so much, he creates new life. This also serves as a basis for characters later on in the series. This is where I'd like to expand on the character archetypes a little. I believe that every villain archetype serves as a mirror or inversion of sorts to one of the protagonist archetypes, which ties into the aspects of Jungian psychology that this series heavily takes from. Grahf and Id both serve as inversions of the contact, showing what they ultimately would have become without the influence of the antitype, someone who is extremely codependent in order to fully achieve what she was meant to do. And of course Ellie has her own inversion in Miyoung. I genuinely find Miyoung terrifying. The cosmic horror elements of this franchise are some of my favorite parts, and she perfectly encapsulates that. But hell, even characters like Bart and Satan get a mirror in the form of characters like Ramses and Krillian respectively. Whilst Bart shows himself to accept help from others and grows stronger through it, Ramses' mindless obsession with hunting Faye down eats away at him. He gradually loses his humanity, and by the time the game has reached its conclusion, chances are he's either dead or completely broken to the point of a complete psychological shutdown. Meanwhile, Krillian is so obsessed with his research and ultimately his desire to become a god that the Zora itself literally ends up consuming him. And since we're on the subject, holy shit, Citan is a genius character. It's clear from the very beginning that he's extremely shady and knows way too much, and his connections to Solaris are very evident. The game actively nudges you into believing he'll end up betraying the party, which it ultimately fakes out when he tries to get to it. Even if he was essentially Truman showing Faye's life during the time in Lahan, it was never out of malice. It was fear. And that same fear is why I find the Lahan village section to be one of the best. Sure, it lulls you into a false sense of security and then makes it violently fall apart, but at the same time, it also shows us something pretty odd. Citan is living away from the rest of the village. It's enough of a distance to make you wonder how people are supposed to reach the supposed village doctor in an emergency. It's something you'll not realize immediately, but once they reveal that he was explicitly there to watch over Faye, it becomes pretty evident that he was fully aware that something like this was probably going to happen. He fucking knew that it would one day show up and destroy everything, and he built his house far away enough to the point that it is the only thing that remains of Lahan village even in the endgame. It's a genius bit of environmental storytelling and really reinforces why I love this game. Another thing I'd like to talk about is how I really hate it when people call this game anti-religious or some bullshit. No, it's not. If anything, it's pro-religion, explicitly stating that the belief in God needs to be found within oneself. Did those people and I play the same fucking game? Because if we did, then they should know that Deus isn't actually God, right? That's enough about spoilers, let's move on. Don't worry, I didn't forget about the Zohar, but I believe it's best to leave talking about it to the Saga section of the series, since there's more than enough time for that. For now, let's invite the clueless not players back in. And thus concludes Xenogears, Episode 5. Yeah, you heard me. It'll make sense shortly. Now that we've got the game itself out of the way, let's start talking about the remaining side materials. First off, Perfect Works. Well, I guess the full name is Perfect Works the real thing, but that name is fucking stupid, I'm not calling it that. This is required reading for everyone who's played Xenogears. This fucking thing fills every single minor gap in the story and fleshes out the world to an absurd degree. Almost all our information on how the rules of this franchise work stems from this fucking book. And what does this also give us? The outline to the franchise's episode structure. Xenogears was conceived as a 6-episode epic, with the first game being merely episode 5. Perfect Works gives us an elaborate timeline of every episode and outline of their contents. Unfortunately, Takahashi never got to finish the Xenogears version of the timeline, but that definitely didn't stop him from trying again with both Xenosaga and Xenoblade stories, which also follow the exact same structure, albeit with some changes. I'll explain when I get around to them. Fact of the matter is, you should absolutely read what's in this fucking thing. It doesn't just enhance the story, it completes it. Unlike the next thing we'll talk about, which does neither. Xenogears, a god-slaying story first chapter, is a non-canonical prequel novel to the game, written by Masatoshi Kusakabe, and published on April 1st, 1998, almost 2 months after the game. And although the release date may fool you into thinking it's a joke of a story, it's not. At the time of the original version of this video, I had no way of actually reading it myself. Then, mere weeks after uploading the supercut, someone uploaded a fully translated scan of the entire thing. I guess that must be karma or something. The story takes place 3 years before the events of the game, and follows 2 wholly original characters, Darga Rishuna and his partner Lemia Seiju. The two work as a pair of prospectors in Ave. You can basically think of them as tomb raiders who search for treasures in the lost ruins and then sell them back to the Ave government for cash. Unfortunately, due to the war going on, the whole excavation business thing isn't doing so hot, leaving Darga in a bit of a rough spot. After returning back to his home in Pries, a city that's actually mentioned in Perfect Works despite never showing up in the game, he decides to go out for a drink, where he runs into none other than Grahf, whose presence is quite imposing even in text form. Starting with this encounter, Darga and Lemia get dragged into a bigger conspiracy involving some gears, with Grahf pulling all of the strings. Going off of Japanese reviews, opinions on the book are quite mixed. Some praise the interesting story, though I've mostly seen people just complain about how it isn't Xenogears enough. Personally, I found it to be an enjoyable standalone read that does some cool things with the narrative, and I can appreciate the expanded world building to what I've seen in the game. Despite the occasional inconsistencies, it's also only 80 pages long, so it's a relatively short read, with a lot of illustrations thrown in as well. And man, the art is just sick as hell. It was done by one Naochika Morishita, who was one of the lead artists for Bloody Roar up until 3, and he's done a bunch of other stuff as well. I'll link his Twitter in the description, he's really good. Now, this one's pretty cool. It's a short manga containing several stories. Most of them are comedic, but some are serious, and I genuinely believe that the latter do enhance the world of the game and the characters quite a bit. Emeralda, for instance, gets quite a bit more of a character than she ever could have in the short screen time the game gives her, and it helps that the comedic stories are pretty funny as well. I would definitely encourage you to give this one a read. It's difficult to say more about it without going into spoilers, so instead I'll just say that the art is pretty nice with multiple artists working on the different stories. If you know what a 4-koma is, then you already know what to expect. This is a collection of small 4-panel gag comics, the kind of thing you'd find on the back of a newspaper. They're fun, and while some are significantly funnier than others, they're not meant to be taken seriously, so there's really no use complaining about them either. Worth noting, however, is the fact that similarly to comic Anthology, several of the comics are drawn by different artists, which is also pretty fun. Both it and comic Anthology were translated by some fans some years ago and are easily found online. And lastly, we have Xenogears, Thousands of Daggers. I really don't have a lot to say about this one since it's just the game's script with some screenshots attached. Yep, that's it really. After Square decided to put their focus solely on the Final Fantasy series, Takahashi and several of the staff involved in Xenogears became dissatisfied with the state of the company and decided to leave in order to fund their own company. While searching for a publisher to fund their games, most declined. However, they eventually found someone in Namco, as its founder, Masaya Nakamura, shared a lot of the team's ideals. And so, on October 1st, 1999, Monolith Software was born, as a Namco subsidiary. After this, they'd then proceed to take a year to gather sufficient staff in order to start developing their first major project, culminating in a development cycle that lasted around 2 years and a budget of 1 billion yen. And so, in 2002, the world was given Xenosaga Episode 1, Der Wille zur Macht. Xenosaga 1 is a weird game. I like it, but it's extremely rough around the edges. It's clear that a lot of the staff was still wet behind the ears. Everything from the visuals to the combat to the dungeon design lacks a certain polish that you'd expect from this kind of game. Yet I won't deny that there is some charm to it all. Since the story of this game isn't self-contained but one continuous narrative, I'll keep talking about it in greater detail for after we've discussed Xenosaga 3, as that marks the end of the series. I will however be referring to it whenever it's relevant, so instead let's talk about the gameplay. Saga 1's general area structure differs quite a bit from Gears. Instead of a large open world map that connects every individual area, the game possesses something more akin to a level structure. Each area counts as its own stage of sorts, with the player automatically being transported to the next one once they beat the current one. There are primarily two kinds of these stages. The first are the dungeon levels, which have a layout about on par with the complexity of the ones in Gears. The second are the towns, where you can buy equipment, though as the series goes on, the need for those is eventually entirely fizzled out by the shop spots within dungeons themselves. Sometimes, when towns are particularly big, they'll actually have a sort of overworld map to themselves for travel between the individual areas within said town. At any point, you can use the EVS system to instantly teleport to the entrance of any place you've been to before, including dungeons, to get any items you might have missed or the like. This structure is entirely consistent throughout all three of the main games. But you know what isn't? Literally anything else. This isn't even an exaggeration. Despite every game continuing the same story, they could not be any more different from one another. Combat, music, voice actors, visuals, and even area layouts are never consistent across all three games. For now, let's not get ahead of ourselves and stick to Saga 1 specifically. Then we can discuss the differences in the later games when we get to them. The combat in Saga 1 is extremely ambitious if nothing else. Much like in Gears, you have a set number of action points and can use as many attacks per turn as you have AP left. And that's about where the similarities end. Defending for a turn and having some AP left over in general now carries over to the next turn. Each turn you get 4 and you can have up to 6 at any time. Having a full AP meter then allows you to use a special attack by pressing a third button after the first 2 inputs. These input chains are referred to as tech attacks and you can customize them however you want, setting up to 4 low ones and 2 high ones, with tech attacks having different elemental attributes and some being ranged, which actually ties into the next thing. There's a row system now and it's entirely pointless. As you'd expect, the back row takes less damage but can only attack ranged. The only time this is ever relevant is during one specific fight in the endgame that can forcefully put your characters to the back. Honestly, the same can be said about most of the shit in this game. For instance, after each battle you gain experience as you'd expect, but you also gain tech points, ether points, and skill points. Ether points let you unlock new ether spells, which you can also transfer to other characters if you like, though you have to manually equip them after unlocking them, which threw me off a couple of times. Tech points let you increase individual stats, and skill points let you extract skills from items so you can permanently gain their passes on your character. These are, in theory, really cool. But the issue is that the game gives you very little of each after any battle. I was already more than halfway through the game by the time I had enough SP on Shion to extract even a single useful skill. The ether skills you can unlock are cool and all, but not transferring Medica All, which is the game's standard party heal spell to all your characters, is essentially setting yourself up for failure. They just probably realized that the points they give you just aren't enough, so they made it a pain in the ass to escape from battles. It's something you can only do if you're either using Shion's goodbye ether attack, or if you use a dedicated item. Now granted, the items are cheap and the spell uses only a single ether point, but the game should have just had a dedicated escape button. Anyway, back to the combat proper, because here's yet another mechanic that is severely undercooked. The AGSS, or AUGs for short, function as Saga 1's gear replacement. In their same vein, you can summon them at any point in battle and do some good damage depending on the equipment you give them, though they can't heal others. Unlike gears, they also don't use up fuel, but ammo instead. I'd go into them some more, but the issue is that they're kinda pointless. By the time you're halfway through the game, your own characters will be more than capable enough to keep up with them and even outperform them quite easily, as AUGs upgrades are extremely expensive and just not that useful after a certain point early on. And then there's yet another completely underutilized mechanic. Every turn is assigned a certain bonus effect, which can range anywhere from gaining more money after a fight to increasing critical damage. This is completely negligible for anything but a single boss fight. Now I know this section has been pretty negative so far, but there is one really fucking good mechanic in here, though it had yet to be refined. Whenever your characters take and deal damage, they slowly raise a boost meter. Once it's full, you can use it up to force that character's turn to come next, assuming certain conditions are met, of course. This mechanic is really cool and would be the one combat related thing that sticks around for the rest of the series, though it gradually changed for the better, which we'll get into later. All of this becomes completely irrelevant in the endgame. You see, throughout the games you'll constantly come across secret doors labeled segment addresses. Returning to them with the corresponding decoder lets you enter them to find some sort of secret item. In Saga 1 specifically, these sometimes contain robot parts. The more you find them bring to a certain NPC, the more you obtain secret ether attacks for Shion, which are all incredibly strong in their own right. However, giving them all unlocks the Kaiser. Aside from following in Gears' footsteps by having a mandatory Gao Gaiga reference, it is also the strongest attack in the game. It may consume a shit ton of EP, however, once you use it and the lengthy animation plays, which you can thankfully skip with the start button, and then it deals a flat 9,999 damage to every enemy. This includes the final boss. Well, every enemy other than it doesn't have anywhere close to that much health actually, so that completely trivializes the endgame portion of the game. This is going to become a theme, as you'll see. However, super bosses do exist, and amongst them is one that must never be forgotten. Grey Joe is the epic. He loves gunslinging. Do not break the wardrobes in the Elsa, because this fight is fucking bullshit. That's it for the gameplay, so let's talk about the music. This game would mark the last time that Mitsuda would be composing for the series in a very long time. So you'd hope that it's really good in that case, right? Well, yeah. It's a fantastic soundtrack and every track sounds like it'd perfectly fit into Xenogears. The issue is that there's not much of it. The soundtrack has over 50 songs, yet they're mostly relegated to cutscenes. There's only a single battle theme in the entire game. Be it for random enemies or bosses, they all have the exact same music. The only exception is the final boss's theme, which is in reference to the final boss of Gears. This track will make you go insane. I hear the opening sting in my fucking sleep. Thanks to the bigger budget and better hardware of this game, Xenosaga actually features full voice acting for all of its cutscenes. Now, Xenogears did have voice acting as well, however I didn't think to mention it until now as it was relegated to battle grunts and very sparse animated cutscenes. The English dub of the Saga series is incredibly hit or miss. There are instances where I actually prefer the English cast, such as with Albedo and Jin in Saga 2 and 3, however sometimes the Japanese dub is simply far and away superior. The English dub also suffers from another very big problem. The voice cast does not stay consistent. Most of the core cast got completely replaced for 2, yet almost all of them came back for Saga 3, barring some characters. Because of this, playing through the series in English can be extremely jarring, which is a shame since the dub in Saga 3 especially holds up damn well. In Japan on the other hand, the cast wasn't just consistent, but lots of voice actors actually reprised their roles as the archetypes from Gears. As an example, Hideyuki Tanaka, who voiced Satan in Gears, voices Jin in this series, and Yumi Toma, who voices Ellie in Gears, voices Nephilim in Saga. It's a minor detail, but one that fans of both will definitely come to appreciate, especially since the Japanese cast of Saga is really fucking good. Something you've all probably realized by now, however, is that Saga 1 isn't a particularly pretty game, to say the least. The series has always struggled with its visuals, and I'd argue that it wouldn't be until Saga 3 that they finally reached a good aesthetic. Saga 1 is a game I personally find both ugly in art direction and art style. Saga 2 I believe looks great in concept art, perfectly nailing the vibe these games go for, however in execution it looks absolutely abysmal and extremely uncanny, which is only made worse by the fact that some characters still use their Saga 1 models, which results in a pretty irritating contrast. Saga 3's direction is comparatively simpler than 2's, however it results in a game that looks honestly pretty fucking good for 2006 with visuals that hold up damn well to this day. Now that we've covered everything else, let's touch on the story of Saga 1, which is simultaneously its greatest strength and biggest flaw. The main issue is that it's a prologue more than anything else. The characters are all introduced and the greater conflicts and storylines are set up. However, it's all foreshadowing, as practically none of the questions posed by this game are actually answered in it. Hell, some of the shit that gets foreshadowed doesn't even become relevant until episode 3. A good example of this is the subtitle, Der Wille zur Macht, or in English, The Will to Power. It's a concept coined by German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. In the same vein, both episode 2, Jenseits von Gut und Böse, and episode 3, also Sprach, Zarathustra, are named after his works as well. The series is generally chock full of Nietzschean concepts, and his philosophy plays a key role throughout not just the series, but all of Xeno. However, Xenosaga 1 is so focused on being a setup for what's to come that it's easy to forget that this is the case. It's part of the reason why I've seen so many people call this game pretentious when it really isn't. I like this game, I really do, but it's difficult to recommend to someone as a standalone package because it's simply incomplete, especially since the ending shows off snippets of things that won't get relevant until way later down the line. I won't get into details as I promised, however, I may as well go into the main party's archetypes again, that way we have something to work with until later parts of the video. Shion is a giant hypocritical bitch and encompasses the contact, while simultaneously possessing the brains of the Usuki archetype. KOS-MOS is a cross between the anti-type and the Kasim's emotional growth. Junior is a mix between Bart and Billy, whilst also looking like a younger Jesseya. Momo is a cross between Choo-Choo, Maria and Esmeralda. Ziggy is like Ricardo except he's German instead of Mexican, and Chaos possesses traits from Satan, though he's more of a wildcard than anything, for reasons I'll get to when we finally discuss spoilers. Saga 2 and 3 also feature one more party member in the form of Shion's brother, Jin. This guy is literally just Satan to a core. He is also my favorite of the bunch for reasons we'll also be discussing later. And so we've reached the end of Xenosaga 1, which ended up becoming a smash hit, being the 7th best-selling game of 2002 and spawning an entire multimedia franchise. But before we get to all the side material it spawned, let's talk about this little oddity is a Japan-only re-release of the first game. It primarily adds two things, the first being some costumes for KOS-MOS and Momo, and the other being a cutscene viewer. Where things get interesting, however, is the cutscenes themselves. You see, this version of the game exclusively features the English dub of the game. Not only that, but it seems to be an older version than the one in the Western release, as it features several differences in certain phrases being used. Furthermore, the cutscenes use the censored English versions. This actually leads me to talk about the censorship in these games for a bit. This segment will contain minor spoilers for all three main games, so if you'd rather not hear about that, please skip to the Xenosaga Freaks segment, but only two things were censored in this game. There's a scene in which a character rips his head off, and some other things involving him. In the Japanese version, he does this with a knife. Almost all of it is covered by a black fog, and you can't really see much of it. In English, he uses his bare hands to do that, and you can see the head rolling on the floor. Personally, I find this censored version way more graphic than the original. Xenosaga 2 had a similar case where, again, everything like blood and whatnot was left entirely unchanged. However, they replaced someone shooting themselves in the head with a gun, with them using an energy sphere instead, though the ensuing blood splatter remained. Saga 3, on the other hand, is by far the most violent of the three games, yet the English version has all instances of blood removed, which really fucks over a lot of the environmental storytelling in my opinion. But yeah, that's about all I have to say about Reloaded. Xenosaga Freaks is the first spin-off in the series, and is kind of comparable to something like Tales of Fandom, wherein it's a compilation of multiple things. There are 4 modes in this game, if you can call them that. I'll just go through them in order of relevancy. The first is an encyclopedia of terms used throughout Saga 1. It's kind of similar to the database in Saga 3, which we'll get to later. The next is Kotoba no Puzzle, Xenopetan, which is just a Xenosaga reskin of Namco's Kotoba no Puzzle Mojipatan series. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically Japanese Scrabble. The third mode takes up a bulk of the game, that being Xenokomi. This is a lighthearted visual novel set sometime during the events of Saga 1, and actually happens to be canon. It never takes itself seriously and really plays into the silliness of it all, which contrasts the nature of the series' main games instead. If you ever wanted to see KOS-MOS or Momo as catgirls, then this is the game for you. What helps is that some fans actually translated most of the available routes and even ported them to PC, so shoutouts to that. Now the last mode is a simple demo of Xenosaga 2. This demo contains the entire prologue to the game, and to my knowledge does not have any difference to the final release. Though I may be wrong on that, as I didn't explicitly look for any while playing through it. In a perfect world, this would be a perfect segue into episode 2, which would technically come next in release order. However, before we do that, I'd first like to dedicate some time to the adaptations of episode 1. The anime sucks. There is no sugarcoating it, this is just a bad show. It fails both as a standalone series and especially as an adaptation. Aside from the obvious stuff like just flat out being extremely ugly and the animation being very awkward to look at, it also just suffers from a lot of pacing issues. Not to mention the story was greatly altered and mostly for the worse. Things like the introductory segments for Ziggy and Junior are completely absent, leading to them joining the party being extremely jarring, as the characters were not properly established prior. And entire areas and characters were completely cut for virtually no reason. Instead, they added an all-new character named Kirsch, who really doesn't add anything of value to the story at all. I know this might sound like a lot of nitpicking, but for a game consisting almost entirely of foreshadowing, this shit really adds up, and ends up causing a lot of problems with consistency later down the line. Even the dub is a downgrade. Practically none of the voice actors from the game returned for the show. I'll be the first to admit that the dub in the game is very flawed, but this show's dub is on a whole new level of bad. Practically the only saving grace of the anime is the fact that its lead writer, Yuichiro Takeda, would end up being the writer for several Xeno games going forward, more specifically the DS ports of Saga 1 and 2 and the entire Blade series. I'm mentioning this because I think it's funny that a man such as him would end up being involved with Xeno, as those games heavily reference Sunrise's Brave series, which he also wrote for in the past. The manga fares a little better than the anime, though it does come with some issues of its own. For one, it was allegedly written by a guy named Atsuhi Baba. I don't think this guy even exists, because for the life of me, the only thing I could ever find about him was this manga. For the most part, it follows the events of the game pretty faithfully, barring the occasional cutscene here and there. However, I can't seem to find out whether or not more than the initial 4 volumes even existed, so I'm absolutely clueless if the manga was ever even finished or not. At the very least, what is there has been translated by fans into English. Now, before we move on to episode 2, I'd first like to talk about Xenosaga Outer File. This is a series of 3 drama CDs following multiple series of events, some during and some shortly after Saga 1. Much like Xenokomi, these are canon, though hardly important to the grander narrative, serving more as fun side material to bridge the gap between games. The most important thing about them is that they introduce the characters Richard and Herman, who serve as recurring bosses throughout both Saga 2 and 3, as well as serving some additional world building. Much like for Xenokomi, some fans also got together to translate them and turn them into a Flash-based pseudo-visual novel, so that's a nice way of going about reading them. Xenosaga Episode 2, Jenseits von Gut und Böse, is quite possibly the worst Xeno game ever made, and that fucking sucks, for a large variety of reasons really. You see, this game was actually my and many people's first exposure to Xeno as a whole. Europe never got Xenogears or Episode 1, thus this was the first game in the series I ever played. So you might be wondering, well, how were people meant to follow the story if they couldn't play the first game? And the answer is this. PAL copies of the game came with a special DVD that contained a collection of every single cutscene of Episode 1. It was basically like those XJRPG, the movie videos that you can find on YouTube, that are totally disjointed arrangements of every cutscene with jarring transitions at every spot where there should be a fight. I really wish I could say this game is better than most people give it credit for, but I simply cannot. This game is an absolutely soul-sucking experience, and despite being barely 30 hours long, feels like it takes an eternity. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, and let's run it down from the top. The opening portion of the game is genuinely fantastic. The Miltian conflict is a major event mentioned multiple times throughout the series, and being able to play through a portion of it is extremely cool. And not only do they introduce the new ES battles, but it also introduces most of the relevant mechanics in a pretty interesting way. And then they cap it off with this genuinely really fucking awesome mocap sword fight between Jin and Margulis, only for them to never expand on anything in terms of mechanics and have absolutely nothing ES related until Disc 2, as well as immediately cutting back to the present where things aren't nearly as interesting anymore. Combat has changed a lot, but unfortunately not for the better. Let's talk about it. While your attacks still consist of several button inputs in a certain order, attacks are now attributed to one of 3 areas, A, B, and C, or in normal people terms, high, middle, and low. Every enemy has some sort of weakness to a certain combination of these, like BBC or ABCC. The way you achieve these specific orders is by effectively using boosts, which is essentially unchanged from the first game. However, they are now a shared resource amongst all characters and you can charge up to 3 of them at any given time. Once you hit the target's weakness, they become toppled and can be launched, allowing you to do much more damage. This is something that would actually end up coming back in the Blade games. There's also the ability to move behind enemies in order to do even more damage with back attacks. Once unlocked, you can also use boost on certain characters to enable them to use special partner attacks, which honestly look really fucking cool. And hell, you can even swap out characters mid-battle now. Augs are also completely gone and never to be seen again. Instead, you now have the aforementioned ES units, which are much closer to how Gears functioned in, well, Xenogears, as in being completely standalone fights with their own weapons and equipment that actively need to be upgraded, and can't really be ignored. In this game, game, however, they're essentially just an extension of normal battles, and so really aren't that interesting. Now, all of this sounds just fine and dandy, right? Too bad they ruin it in frankly the worst way they possibly could have. For one, the way skills are reworked fucking sucks. Every character is practically the same now because everyone gets the same exact skill tree, and it is the most tedious thing in the world to deal with. To unlock a new skill, you first have to get enough of 2 separate types of skill points per battle, then use the first to unlock the subtree, then select a specific subgroup within that subtree to select one of 4 skills to unlock with the second currency, and to unlock the next best subtree, you first have to have fully unlocked a subgroup within the prior subtree. However, sometimes skills within a subgroup are locked and can't be unlocked until some specific and sometimes random ass conditions have been met. This would be nothing more than an annoying inconvenience if the game didn't give you as few skill points as Ebenezer Scrooge pays his employees. I'll be honest, for most of my time on this playthrough, I just used to save carryover rewards from Saga 1. Which is a swimsuit for Ziggy and KOS-MOS, as they're much better equips than most of the shit you're ever gonna get out of the skill tree. The worst part of it all is that the enemies in this game have health out the fucking ass. Everyone is ridiculously spongy, and it takes forever to kill even the weakest of low-level grunts. And don't even think of breezing through the endgame, because guess fucking what? Kaiser is completely inaccessible until the post-game, so what is even the point? So let's say you don't want to deal with that right now, and you just want to rush your ass to the next save point. Well, you can actively run from battles now. Just a tiny issue. Only specific characters can do that, like Shion or Momo. I have no fucking idea why they did that, but it is just completely pointless. By far the worst part of this game, however, has to be the new side quest system. If you want to effectively level up, or get any sort of good progress in, you'd best be prepared to engage with this dogshit system, consisting entirely of tedious fetch quests, barring like a couple of exceptions, because half the best gear and equipment in this game is stuck behind it. And don't even think about ignoring the side quests and just progressing the main story, because you won't be anywhere near prepared enough to take it on half the time without doing the shit. Simply put, Xenosaga Episode 2 is a 15-hour game stretched to 30 with some of the worst side content I've ever had the displeasure of being forced to experience in a JRPG. By the time I was done replaying this game, I just wanted to take a nap because I was just completely drained. Even the story didn't escape being extremely flawed. I sure fucking hope you like Albedo and Junior, because this game is all about them, and everyone else gets almost completely sidelined. And I really don't think I have to get into the visuals. This game is simply fucking ugly, no matter how you slice it. Even the dub isn't safe, as half the cast was completely replaced for literally no reason like I'd mentioned earlier. And while most of the first game's voice actors did come back for free, some of them did retain their Saga 2 voices, also as I'd mentioned before. However, while this is extremely jarring, I will not deny that some of the voice actors for 2 are much better than the ones in 1. But all of this just really fucking sucks because there's genuinely a lot of good buried underneath this giant steaming pile of shit. The story, whilst extremely junior-centric, is pretty fucking good, and the music is, in my humble opinion, the best in the entire franchise. Starting with this game, the music for the series would end up being composed not by Yasunori Mitsuda, but by one Yuki Kajiura, whom some of you might know from her work on shows like Madoka Magica or the Many.Hack anime. She did a fantastic job blending together the Celtic influence and general instrumentations established by Mitsuda with a fresh sounding sci-fi tone, perfectly befitting of the space drama oriented series. I cannot name a single song in this game that ended up being grating or otherwise unenjoyable. It's just an all-around fantastic soundtrack. It also introduces one of my favorite tracks in a video game, Fatal Fight, which we'll get more into in the Saga Free and spoiler sections. I feel like a lot of the game's flaws can be attributed to the fact that Takahashi took a very hands-off approach for this game, which is to say he gave the team the general story outline and fucked off. Ultimately, this would also end up being the last time Soraya Saga would write for a Perfect Works game, and to add insult to injury, the game sold extremely poorly, in spite of actually having been released in Europe for once, reaching just over 50% of Namco's projected sales target. But thankfully, that doesn't mean that the series was over, far from it. Just by looking at the time left on the video, you can easily tell that there's still quite a bit left to go. When I originally made this video, Pied Piper was partly lost media. A ROM for the game had never been dumped, and so the only real way to experience it was to watch a playthrough of it on YouTube. And if you didn't understand Japanese, read the fan translation of the entire script. But in 2025, the unthinkable happened and someone actually found the ROM. And that's fantastic, not only because it's a massive win for media preservation, but because Pied Piper is not only a major important narrative part of the story, but in my opinion, possibly the best self-contained plot in the franchise. Being full of political intrigue and some excellent character writing. The game is set about 100 years before the events of the first game, and follows the life of Ziggy, then Federation counter-terrorist Jan Sauer, before his eventual death and resurrection as a cyborg. And without it, Ziggy's entire arc in the third game simply doesn't work. The dynamic between Jan and his subordinates is really good, and the slow realization of what is going to happen as the story progresses is fantastic. There's so much to unpack here, and all of it is written wonderfully. Hell, I'd argue it's more important than half the shit that happens in the first game. If you do intend on playing through the series, then I implore you to go through at the very least the script of this game before playing Saga Freaks. As for the gameplay itself, I mean, it's a Java game, alright. I didn't expect them to be as ambitious as, you know, Devil May Cry, Dante x Virgil, but I was hoping for something. It's essentially just a bunch of bare-bones dungeons with random encounters that lead to a carbon copy of Xenosaga 1's combat system, with the rows removed. I mean, I guess the sprite work is neat. I like the cutscene CGs and the portraits for everyone. As for the music, but thankfully you don't have to play this version to experience the game in playable form anymore, because the same year we also got a fan remake made in RPG Maker led by Cyclone Fox. This is hands down the best way to experience the game now, including all new art, an entirely original soundtrack inspired by Kajiura's work for Saga 2 and 3, and gameplay based on 3 as well. It's really good and I highly recommend checking it out, and I'll link it in the description. But since this is a fan work and I don't want to derail this segment too much, let's move on. This is a remake of both Xenosaga 1 and 2 as a single game for the DS, and if you think this sounds like a horrible idea and a recipe for disaster, well, you'd be forgiven. The story is the one thing in the game that has received the least changes. It adjusts some events from Saga 2 to be more in line with the first game, such as giving Momo a bow in Xenosaga 1 instead of a rod so it lines up with the later games, or moving around some bits of the story for a better narrative flow. It also adapts the entirety of Outer Files, as well as adding several new scenes and side stories that expand on the world, which can be unlocked as you progress throughout the games. The gameplay, on the other hand, has seen a lot of changes. Both games now use the same combat system, which is essentially the same as in Saga 1, however you can actively walk around the battlefield. Unfortunately, this comes with a caveat. There are random encounters again, and lots of them at that. I was really hoping there'd be no more after Xenosaga 1 got rid of them, but unfortunately not. However, they did also add the ability to press L whenever highlighted text appears in order to get a little database entry on it, which can definitely help alleviate some of the overwhelming exposition dumps in the first game. Aesthetically, this version's dialogue, sprites, and cutscenes take a lot after the anime, which makes sense as most of the team involved in the game's development had previously worked on said anime. The characters all retained their Saga 1 designs throughout the entire story, barring KOS-MOS, whose model gets upgraded early into Saga 2, and also Jin, who now uses the same combat suit that he also wears in A Missing Year, which we'll get to later. The battle and overworld sprites, on the other hand, take directly after Xenogears, in a decision that I personally find quite pleasing. By far the strangest thing about this game has to be the soundtrack. Neither Mitsuda nor Kajiura composed it. Instead, the job went to Kosuke Yamashita, who had previously scored for the anime and did a pretty good job at imitating Mitsuda's tone, so he's not a bad composer at all. But I have to wonder, what the fuck happened here? The music has always been an important part of the series' identity, yet this soundtrack doesn't fit at all. It lacks any of the Celtic influences and instead just sounds like something you'd hear in a SNES Final Fantasy knockoff. It doesn't fit the tone that the games are going for whatsoever, and it's simply jarring to listen to. Another thing is that due to the game's sprite-based nature, it loses a lot of the cinematic nature of the console games, which was kind of one of their big selling points. Other than these issues though, I'd consider this to be the definitive version of Saga 2. However, you'd have to play through all of Saga 1 to reach the Saga 2 portions of the game, and these remakes were never translated, neither officially nor by fans, so knowing Japanese is your only real way of playing these versions of the games, I'm afraid. I actually don't have a lot to say or show about the identity device. It was basically just an executable you could load onto your PC that would connect to the official Xenosaga servers and function as a sort of online newsletter for the series. A neat novelty, if not a clear product of its time. Missing Year is a browser-based visual novel which bridges the rather large time skip between Xenosaga 2 and 3, and that is extremely important to Saga 3's larger narrative. What Pied Piper is to Ziggy, Missing Year is to Jin. His character gets fleshed out a lot more than it did in Saga 2, and it adds a lot to his dynamic with Shion, who by this point in the story is slowly but surely breaking down. Skipping this part of the story is not optional. It is absolutely necessary to fully understand both Shion and Jin as well as their actions in Saga 3, and thankfully it was entirely archived and translated, and you can easily find it on YouTube. It does however come with a couple of problems. For one, it incoherently jumps around the timeline every now and then, which can lead to it being a bit confusing sometimes, though that's usually not a big deal thanks to its short runtime, being barely over an hour long. Unfortunately, it also has some highly compressed audio, and the quality of the art varies greatly across the chapters. Nonetheless, this is absolutely a must read for anybody playing through the series. Before we move on to episode 3, I'd first like to go through some of the interesting side materials in the series, starting with Weekly Xenosaga. This is, as the name implies, a series of magazines promoting the release of their respective games, with each of the 3 games getting several volumes of the magazine each. These usually include lots of previews of the game, information on the characters, concept arts, and special artwork. These are in no way important, but the art exclusive to them is pretty cool. Xeno Emissions is a series of 3 concept art collections by series production designer Koichi Mugitani, better known by his alias Choco. Whilst Tanaka was still a character designer for Saga 1 and 2, Choco would primarily be the one to design the mechs and whatnot, though he'd actually take over as character designer for Saga 3 as well. He still works at Monolith, doing key art for Xenoblade 3 and having actively designed the mechs for Xenoblade X, which was a similar situation to Saga 1, as Tanaka would actually return to design the games as characters as well. I do recommend looking into Xeno Emissions, as the mechs throughout the series have some pretty awesome and intricate character designs behind them, and I'm generally just a sucker for seeing concept art like this. Just make sure not to read too far, or else you run into some questionable artwork. Much like its elder brother, Xenosaga also received some 4 coma, and really everything I said about the Gears ones applies here as well. Some are quite funny, others aren't, and the art style constantly jumps around thanks to having several artists working on it. Just be mindful that unlike the Xenogears 4 coma, these ones haven't been translated. And also like Gears, Saga received a comic anthology, which, much like the 4 coma, hasn't been translated. And once again, I can only repeat myself, some stories are serious, others are comedic, some are funny, others aren't, and the art style constantly shifts. I will say this though, I don't think that the serious stories for Saga add as much to its role and characters as the ones for Gears do. Now before we move on, there's one more manga I'd like to talk about. You see, there used to be this little series called the Super Comic Gekijo, created by Square Enix, which would make several small comic anthologies, each volume dedicated to a different video game. They did ones for several series from many different companies like Tales of, or Radiata Stories, or even Toshinden, as well as some other series that my hatred for prevents me from mentioning. Basically anything they could get their hands on, they'd make one for. And as fate would have it, Xenosaga would also end up there, under volume 52. This one's really fun. It's just multiple writers having fun and goofing off with the characters and setting, and I found it to be quite funny at times as well. Again, completely untranslated though, so that's a shame. But that's enough about side material for now. It's time to discuss the one thing that justifies this entire dauntless journey of a franchise in my eyes. Xenosaga Episode 3, also Sprach Zarathustra, is one of my favorite video games of all time, and I mean that sincerely. I don't say this lightly, but so much about this game is borderline perfect in my eyes. The only things I'd ever want to change about it are nitpicks. I'll get the story out of the way now, and say that everything that gets set up throughout the entire franchise finally gets a payoff here. It's an incredible climax to a story 5 years in the making, and I'd love to say more, but I'm keeping that for the spoiler section. So instead, let's talk about everything this game does right outside of that, because believe you me, there is a lot. Gameplay has been completely reworked, gone are attack areas and button inputs in favor of a more traditional system. However, this hardly means that they lose strategic depth or mechanical complexity. Far from it. The boost system still exists and is better than ever before. Now there are no longer any weird conditions you have to meet to be able to use it once the meter is full. You can just boost multiple times on the same turn on the same character at that. You can also save up boosts and use them in order to execute a very strong special attack. So there's an added layer of strategy depending on whether you'd rather risk using your boosts to get turns now and hope you can end the fight quickly, or save up your boosts for a strong move that can guarantee a kill. And on top of this, they also added a new system, the break gauge. Every time you take or deal damage, you and the enemy respectively accumulate break points represented by a red meter. Once it's full, you get staggered. The stronger the move, the more it'll add to the break gauge, though some attacks are explicitly there to deal massive break damage, such as Ziggy's choke. Please ignore the sound, he's definitely not breaking this child's neck. I think break is awesome because it adds another layer of resource management and strategy. Maximizing break on enemies, especially bosses, can be critical to effectively beating them, and if you happen to have save data from Saga 2, you start off with a special armor for Shion that not only gives her back the Vector uniform from Saga 1, but also boasts the highest break defense in the game. And since we're already on the subject of armor, I may as well mention that equipment for both characters and ES units now functions like in a normal video game, instead of being a mishmash of mishandled ideas like in Saga 1 and 2. Better late than never, I guess. Now, the new gameplay is great and all, but say you want to run from battles anyway. You finally can. No shitty caveat or anything, you can actually run from battles now, just like that. I don't know why the fuck it took them 8 fucking years to figure this shit out, but again, better late than never. By far my favorite thing about the game's combat, however, is the way they completely eliminate grinding. Remember those boost charge special moves I mentioned earlier? Killing an enemy with one results in an overkill, which greatly increases the EXP, money, and skill points they drop. Use this on a boss, and you never have to worry about grinding for levels until the next one, literally ever. It's tweaked just right, and I think more games should have a mechanic mechanic like this. There's a damn good reason why they went ahead and reused it in the Blade games. And since I already mentioned skill points, the skill tree is back, and functions as a sort of cross between the first two alliterations, except this one doesn't suck. Every skill tree has two paths pertaining to two separate class types, which allows you to build your characters in one of the two preset ways, though there is nothing stopping you from making them a hybrid. This allows for proper player freedom in how to structure your party without making proper setups a giant pain in the ass. Thanks to this, everyone is actually unique again, and choosing your party members has an actual merit, so it helps to make everyone equally useful, since you can still change out party members mid-fight. And say you want to give the tank in your party medica all anyway, well, you can. All throughout the game you can find these things called EX keys, which allow you to unlock new skills with your characters that they otherwise wouldn't be able to get. On the yes side of things, there were two major additions. The first is the new anima awakenings. As you fight, you slowly build up an anima gauge, and once it's full, you can unleash a special attack. It's essentially the mech equivalent of the tech attacks, and also how you achieve overkill in ES fights. The other is co-op attacks. You see, enemies now have elemental strengths and weaknesses that actually matter for once. Hitting the yes enemies with one of their weaknesses will cause your characters to gang up on them, which allows you to deal 2 turns worth of damage in a single one, and it helps that these fights are extremely cinematic, more so than anything else in the series. The mechs fly all around the place, and the camera gets set up appropriately, never staying static for too long. The fight choreography in the series in general is extremely cool. This goes doubly so for the fights and cutscenes. Just like in Saga 2, this shit is mocapped and it shows. Another change that was made to the gameplay that was made for both on-foot and ES segments is how the traps work. In the first 2 games, dungeons would be littered with canisters you could break to give enemies a debuff. Using them effectively was always kind of a pain in the ass, since you have to actively lure the enemy towards you first. In this game, there's something you can actively place down yourself, which actually makes them really useful this time around, without the caveat of having to lure an enemy to you and risking a preemptive encounter first. This is especially useful since starting a fight from behind also puts you at an advantage. The combat area design, environmental storytelling, visuals, and so on are all better than they ever have been before. Even the English dub is at its best here. You can tell the voice actors had enough time with their roles by now to really make their performances shine. Most of my complaints are nitpicks, but there are 2 that are bigger than others. Both of them have to do with how you get certain characters' ultimate weapons. You see, in this game you can get so ridiculously busted in the endgame that you can beat the entire finale of it without ever taking as much as a single point of damage. Doing the side quests and exploring the world gives you access to things like super bosses, which in turn reward you with insane gear, like a ring that makes it so every ether attack only uses a single ether point, and of course ultimate weapons for every party member. Here's the problem. For Ziggies you have to grind out 99 of a certain endgame item, which is a pain in the ass and honestly not worth it. And for juniors you have to beat one of the hardest difficulties in the minigame Haycocks, which is stupidly fucking difficult and I hate it here. However, it is also pretty pointless to get them because doing literally anything else will make you strong enough to kill every enemy within 3 turns and without ever taking damage. And yes, this includes the final boss. This actually segues nicely into another thing I've neglected to mention until now. There's minigames in this series, lots of them actually, and I've never played a single one that wasn't Haycocks. I'd show footage of them, but how the fuck would I do that if I've never played them? They're there if you're into that sort of thing, I guess, but personally I'll just stick to the main game. Now, before I move on to the books and ultimately the spoiler section, which will cover all the ground I neglected to mention thus far, I'd like to address the music. Yuki Kajiura went all fucking out with this soundtrack. Whilst I do prefer the second game's OST, this one is honestly just as good for very different reasons. A lot of 2's OST was bombastic and felt like an action movie. This game on the other hand goes for a much more somber and subdued tone, which seriously adds to the sense of finality of this game. It also does something no other game in the entire franchise ever did. It uses a constant leitmotif throughout. I'll get into this more in the spoiler section though, so as to not accidentally spoil something with it. Now before I continue, I'd just like to point out that one of the super bosses in this game is a rematch with the fucking Velpa from Xenogears, which you previously fought as a regular boss. I'd consider this a spoiler usually, but it literally just happens. No explanation given. The reason I mention this is because there's a very distinct feeling of how the actual fuck did they get away with this and not get sued by Square that's constantly present throughout the game, and they must have known because the theme for this battle is called Outrageous. Man, I love Saga 3, and yet it sold like utter shit. It had an incredibly strong opening week, coming second in the charts right after New Super Mario Bros. Of all things, and then it immediately dropped off to a ridiculous degree, selling only 333,000 copies worldwide. There's a damn good reason as to why the English version of this game is one of the 10 rarest games on the PlayStation 2. And since the series was never re-released, that's where all the games are unfortunately stuck. Unless you emulate or something, because let's be real, you're never finding a proper copy of this game for less than $300, and that really fucking sucks. Let's talk about the guidebooks for these games real quick before moving on to the final segment of this video. Xenosaga 1 Official Design Materials and Xenosaga Episode 3 Perfect Guide in particular. These are essentially the Perfect Works equivalent for Saga 1 and 3 respectively, and for the most part contain the same kind of content. While I wouldn't consider reading them to be necessary like with Gears, I do believe that Perfect Guides especially greatly enhances the world and story. So if you're in it for the long ride anyway, then you have absolutely nothing to lose by reading this as well. And this covers every single major piece of Xenosaga media ever released. If you, for whatever reason, watched this far and still somehow haven't played these games, then I now implore you to do so. For you, see you when I talk about Xenoblade. Now, for everyone else who has gone on this frankly way too long journey same as I have, let's talk about the one thing that makes it all worth it. Now let's talk about the mission conflict. Can we talk about the mission conflict? Please, I've been dying to talk about the mission conflict all day, okay? This is quite possibly one of the most complex yet simultaneously cohesive conspiracy plots I have ever seen in a video game, and it's executed flawlessly. The first game mentions it and its impact on the characters multiple times, and it's heavily implied that Gion has some involvement with it, as well as showing you a couple glimpses of it throughout Gion and Junior's memories. Then in 2's opening you get to see a snippet of its final moments. The planet is completely in shambles, there's fights going on everywhere, and people are dying left and right. Get shown Jin and Chaos's roles in it, and then in Saga 3 you play through the entire thing, and each time you get more information. The giant web of connections slowly unravels, and yet every minor detail adds up perfectly. There's this really cool chart that shows all of the different factions and connections, and the full scope of this entire thing never really hit me until seeing it. The final moments of the mission conflict in Saga 3 are also easily my favorite moments of the entire series. The entire city is burning. Everywhere you go you see buildings which mere minutes ago were full of life, now decrepit and desolate. People on the verge of death litter the streets, all while the music of the intro to Saga 2, aptly titled Assault, serves as the main backdrop to this entire event. And despite being already aware of what's going to happen, you're still actively pushed to maybe try and change something, until the realization creeps in that the worst possible outcome cannot be prevented. Everything about this part of the game is fucking incredible. About now is also when I should finally address Chaos as a character. Earlier I called him a wild card that takes traits from everyone in Gears. And this is true, as he's easily the single most important character in the party. As the origin of the powers of Anima, he serves the role as a contact, while his dynamic with Wilhelm is that of the antitype and the complement. He's extremely compassionate and a capable leader, but also always composed, which fits him both into Bart and Rico. And of course, he knows way more than anybody else, actively withholding information from everyone and justifying it as simply being a watcher of the events that unfold, making him basically yet another Satan equivalent. I find him to be one of the best parts of the series, because in spite of his relatively small role in the game's standalone stories, he always manages to sprinkle hints throughout, and his facial expressions during critical moments are always visible, and rarely anything other than pain. I just think he's awesome. And since I already mentioned Assault, that's another thing this game does incredibly well. Kajiura doing the music for both 2 and 3 allows for so many parallels by mixing certain themes and remixing certain songs. One really good example being Fatal Fight. This song gets remixed several times throughout both games whenever there's a confrontation between Jin and Margulis, and besides being one of the best fucking songs in the franchise, it's also one of the best ways the music enhances the story. In Saga 2, every time you hear the song, it gets gradually more chaotic and bombastic, as if the tension is constantly rising. But in Saga 3, it gradually gets more and more somber, resulting in this absolutely beautiful rendition of the theme when you confront Margulis for the last time on Mictum. By this point, both characters are aware that it doesn't matter who wins this, it's the last time they'll ever face each other, both having reached a low point in their life, with Margulis losing what's essentially his entire reason for being alive to begin with, and Jin seeing his former lover basically commit suicide whilst lamenting what could have been. It's not just fantastic in its own right, but also perfectly bookends the existence of the ES units throughout the games. The first time Fatal Fight plays was at the very end of the first ES section in the series, the last time at the final ES fight in the franchise. Let's also talk about the villains a bit. This is probably one of the aspects in the series I feel the most conflicted about. Much like in Gears, they all fit into several archetypes, and each serve as an inversion/foil to the main cast. On one hand, you have fantastic ones like Albedo, and on the other you have Kevin. Let's go through them in order of relevance. Margulis is Jin's antithesis, and the game's Ramses archetype stand-in. He doesn't really have many personal stakes in the story. Most of his arc revolves around his faith in Ormus, so once that disappears he doesn't know what to do anymore. He's true to himself and extremely straightforward in his plans, which is good because it's not hard to hate this motherfucker. His inferiority complex and obsession with being better than Jin are lifted directly from Ramses. However, where they differ is how their arcs conclude. Ramses was unable to move past his own problems and eventually broke down because of it, his fate ultimately unknown. Margulis, on the other hand, stands by his beliefs to the very end, deciding that it's better to die than live in a world that denies him his only desire. Albedo is much more interesting, since he serves as a major antagonist in one and as the main villain of two. Thanks to this, he gets a lot of screen time, and the way they write him is incredibly fascinating to me. If you were to just take Saga 1, you have this half-hearted attempt at a psychopath whose entire gimmick is just, look at how fucking insane I am, wahoo! Several friends of mine who didn't get past the first game ended up calling him pretentiously written, and I can kind of see why. The Belpesh scene in the first game is extremely memorable, but without the later context of the connections between Sakura and the URTVs, and in turn their connection to Yudu, it just comes off as the writers trying way too hard to sound smart, instead of being a genuinely terrifying scene. Archetype-wise, he's the it of this game, which I'd say is pretty self-explanatory. The Testaments are just kind of messy. There's only 4 of them, but that doesn't stop them from being pretty inconsistent in their quality. We already talked about Albedo, but then you'd have somebody like Voyager, who just kinda doesn't do a lot. Eric is a pretty interesting character in Pied Piper, but his motivations are basically non-existent in the main games, so his entire role as a Testament is reliant solely on his appearance in PP. There's also Kevin. He's basically a mix of Grahf and Krelian, and I just don't like him. On one hand, he's meant to be hateable, but on the other, he just doesn't get nearly enough screen time for his eventual reveal as a Red Testament to have any impact whatsoever. His motivations are all over the place, and his eventual betrayal of Wilhelm just feels incredibly forced. By far the best of the Testaments though is Virgil. He's barely in the first game, and he may as well not be in the second, but his arc in 3 is fantastic, and the way it ties into Shion's actions throughout the first 2 games is also extremely clever. There's an irony in Virgil of all people, a man defined by contradictions, calling Shion out on being a hypocrite. It also helps that Fabronia has been built up for basically the entire series. There's also Yuriev. Everything about Krelian and Grahf that Kevin doesn't have goes to him. He's probably my favorite of the villains in the series. His motivations are simple to understand and he's incredibly hateable. The way he's built up as a constant force throughout the entire franchise, before ultimately only opposing the party after they become a threat to his plans, is extremely well executed. It helps that his boss fights are some of the most badass moments in Saga 3. And then lastly there's Wilhelm. I have lots of mixed feelings about him. His intentions aren't necessarily malicious, more so that he finds resetting the world to be a necessity. He's essentially the complement / Miyang stand of this game like I mentioned earlier, being more of a force of nature than an actual individual, constantly working as a puppeteer behind the scenes. He serves his role as the ultimate antagonist really well, but I can't help but be a little disappointed at the fact that we never get to fight him once. And this brings me to another point tangentially related to ES fights. Saga 3 especially is full of how the fuck did they get away with this moments, like I mentioned earlier with the Weltall. Mai is literally just Maria. You straight up fight the party's Omnigears in Abel's Arc, and Abel's Arc itself actually looks like the Eldritch, and is literally just the final arena of Gears, and Omega Res Novae is straight up just Deus, but with Weltall and Virge instead of Angels as its hand. The list goes on, but you get the idea. The side stories are another part of why I really like the overarching narrative in these games. So many of them get carried throughout the games. For instance, meeting the relatives of characters from prior games is one thing, but some others are much more explicit. Like this side quest in the first game, where you can help a little girl grow flowers, which gets followed up in Saga 2, and of course, the Professor's plotline. In Saga 1 and 2, the Professor and Assistant Scott are entirely side characters, and meeting them is completely optional. But then in 3 they become actual cast members, and the tone of their sub-story shifts completely, from going from purely comedic to genuinely heartfelt, which is only made stronger by the fact that without them, KOS-MOS would never have been repaired, and everybody would have died in the Zarathustra dungeons, as every ES unit got absorbed by it, barring Asher as it uses Kaiser's core instead of just an Vessel of Anima. It's always the little things that make you appreciate the bigger picture, eh? Now, as I mentioned earlier, Saga 3 also has a frequent leitmotif, being its ending theme, Maybe Tomorrow. This song is fucking genius because it serves a double effect. The first is to give a sense of progression to the game's plot, tying together major moments in the story, such as the approach of the final area. By the time you hear the actual song in the credits, it kind of serves to remind you of all it is you just played through. And least of all, the time I Love You Sincerely played during the motherfucking Alan scene. You know the one. I could never talk about this game without mentioning the scene where Alan finally grows some fucking balls. This scene is so fucking good, but in the same way that the song puts a tie on the game itself, it also does so for the entire series. Joanne may not be singing the songs anymore, but there's a clear theme going throughout the credits songs of the 3 games, and it is entirely reflective of Shion's character arc. Note that this is merely speculative and my personal interpretation, however, from how I understand the songs, Pain is about her inability to let go of her grief about Kevin's death and closing her heart off to anybody else whilst using KOS-MOS as a sort of coping mechanism. Sweet Song is about her reminiscing about their time together, and the titular song being KOS-MOS herself. And lastly, Maybe Tomorrow is about her finally letting go and finding a way to move on, even if the future seems unsure. In that sense, the song is representative of the entire game. It ends on a note of uncertainty. Everybody has lost something valuable to them, most of all Wilhelm and Chaos, who have fulfilled their reason for existing in this world, one perpetuating an endless cycle and the other finally breaking it. But they're all looking forward to tomorrow, unsure of what it will hold. There are no unresolved plot lines. The only thing that's truly uncertain is what comes next. And that's exactly why Jin is one of my favorite characters. He's the kind of character who doesn't know how to properly communicate his feelings, which ended up leading to Pelagri's death, and it took until the very end for Shion to finally understand. But by then it was already too late, and it all culminates in his death. I'll let this scene play out in full. I know you've already seen it, but I do think that it's important for what I'm about to discuss.
静かだ。我が人生、思えばこれほど静かな時はなかったな。私はこれを求めていたのに、いざその時を迎えてみると、かつての喧騒が目まぐるしく変化する日々がむしろ懐かしい。だがこうしているのもまた心地いい。一足先に行ってますよ、シオン。
I won't lie, I cried while watching this on these replays. This scene is incredibly powerful. Until the very end, all of Jin's actions were born out of care for the people around him. And even if he was unable to properly make them understand, he dies content, knowing that thanks to him, they'll have a future worth living for. Chaos' expression at seeing his dead friend also just displays so much with absolutely no words. This is quite genuinely one of my favorite endings to any video game, and all of what I just discussed is perfectly represented in the final shot of the game after the credits. KOS-MOS, almost completely broken, drifting away to Lost Jerusalem, a blue shooting star on its way home. And yet people didn't like it back in the day. I remember reading about people thinking that it's too inconclusive, or that the game lacks the sort of finality the series needed by leaving things open. I really couldn't disagree more. I believe that the open-ended nature of the story fits perfectly with the series as a whole, because if you ask me, to answer the question in the video chapter's title, Xenosaga fundamentally is about people. It delves into the question of what it is that makes us human and repeatedly addresses the idea of letting go of the past and moving on, forging your own future as best version of yourself that you can be. Nobody knows what your future looks like, least of all you, so leaving the future of this world uncertain is in my opinion perfect, because beneath the space opera, beneath Mary Magdalene and Jesus Christ, beneath a cast of severely fucked up people, there's a story which couldn't be any more human if you tried. Xenogears might have ended on a note about loving humanity, but this series is all about that. Or maybe I'm just reading too much into things. That to me is what Xenosaga is all about. And you know what, maybe to you all of this wasn't worth it, and you find the games to be pretentious and the religious imagery to be completely pointless like the reviewers at the time. And hell, maybe it is. But to me this series, and especially Saga 3, is something truly special, and an experience I wish I could have for the very first time, all over again. With the new CEO and the merger with Bandai, Namco as a company changed a lot, and with those changes came a soured relationship with Monolith Soft, who were now looking for a company to move to instead. And so, in 2007, Monolith publicly went from being a Namco developer to a Nintendo one. Around 2006, Takahashi had decided to move on from Perfect Works after the commercial failure of the Xenosaga series, and came up with the idea for a game he would call Monado, Beginning of the World. And then Satoru Iwata came along and asked the title to be changed into Xenoblade in honor of Gears and Saga. Originally this wasn't going to mean anything, but little did anybody know at the time that this would have ended up getting the ball rolling for one of the most ridiculously insane returns I have ever seen. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, because before any of that could happen, the original Xenoblade released in 2010, with the subtitle Chronicles in the West. Whilst making these videos has made me come to appreciate Xenogears and Xenosaga a lot more than originally did, it also resulted in the opposite effect for the Xenoblade games. I by no means mean that the games are bad, for the most part at least, but I find them to be significantly more flawed than I originally did. So let's take it from the top and start with the beginning of the world. Once I separated Saga 1 and Reloaded, I'd like to open this segment by quickly discussing the 3 different versions of Xenoblade 1, as they do have their differences, and unlike Saga, there actually exists an optimal version to play. There's the Wii Original, the new 3DS version, and Definitive Edition. Aesthetically, the original is extremely distinct. Whereas every other game in the series is very clearly going for a sort of anime aesthetic, Xenoblade 1 goes for a much more Western-inspired look. It actually reminds me a bit of what Saga 2 was trying to do, except that it pulls it off much better. Personally, I like this aesthetic. Gameplay-wise, this version laid the groundwork for all the other Blade games, albeit having some pretty weird quirks of its own. For instance, you cannot jump while moving the camera. I don't know why, so don't ask me. I often see Xenoblade 3D get used as the butt of a joke because haha, there's no way the 3DS could handle that game, but honestly, they did a fantastic job of converting the game for the system. It is nearly identical to the original and honestly looks really good for a 3DS game, as long as you don't look at the characters' faces while they're a certain distance away from the camera. Barring the occasional frame drop and the worse audio quality, I cannot name a single reason why this version would in any way not be a serviceable version of the game to play. As for new features, it adds a sound test and a model viewer which are accessed through a roulette type system, and that's it. And lastly, there is Definitive Edition. As the name implies, this is far and away the best version of the game to play. It adds a shit ton of small quality of life improvements that seriously add up, as well as taking the formerly 80% non-Xeno game and retroactively slotting it into the Xeno franchise. We'll get into this later. It also replaces the art style with one that is significantly more anime inspired, which does make it fit in line with every other Xeno game, though I do find it loses a bit of the original's identity. So for the rest of the video, this will be the version I'll be focusing on. Xenoblade Chronicles was many people's first exposure to Xeno, and yet despite originally having absolutely nothing to do with Xeno, it still carries many of the fundamental themes in it. I'll get into this more in the story and characters section, so let's talk about the gameplay real quick. Whereas Gears and Saga were turn-based RPGs, Blade had the genius idea of turning the gameplay into a single-player MMO like FF12 did. Look, I like MMOs from time to time, but as a solo experience it just gets so boring. Essentially, you just stand around and watch your characters attack on their own until one of your special attacks finally recharges, before positioning yourself for its special effect, and then you repeat the process until you've won. Some arts are more effective, attacking from the side, some from behind, and so on, you get the idea. The issue is that they only recharge over time, so half the time in a battle, you're not doing anything at all. The only exception is whenever you're using a special art like Blossom Dance, or boosting the party gauge, which triggers a short QTE. There's like 3 things that are desperate to make it so you just don't zone off. The first is Shulk's visions. Every now and then during battles you can get a vision of the future. What this actually means is that you'll see the next attack is going to kill one of your party members. Now to save them, you can either use some of your party gauge to warn them of the incoming attack, or topple the enemy to pull the aggro towards you instead. The second is the blade combos. The launch mechanic from Xenosaga 2 returns for some godforsaken reason, but with extra steps. Now certain arts can break an enemy, then another topples them, and then you cap it off with a daze to keep them down. Also similarly to Saga 2, these combos do a ridiculous amount of damage. And lastly you have the chain attacks. On the top of the screen you have this thing called the party gauge. It gradually fills up at the same way that the boost meters did in Saga, though their use is very different. You can either use one portion of the gauge to revive an ally, or you can wait until the entire thing is full to use a chain attack. If you do the latter, you can then choose one art to use per character, and after the third one you can do another QTE to be able to land the 4th hit. And depending on how well you're keeping the chain going, you can even get in a 5th and a 6th hit. And that's it. The game basically plays itself, and while I desperately wish I could say more, I just can't bring myself to do so. It is dreadfully boring. This is only made worse by the gem mechanic. Basically, you can craft these items that you can put onto your equipment that function kind of like the materia in FF7. Some of these are so extremely overpowered that you can easily decimate bosses without ever needing to touch a controller at all. Outside of combat, the way you explore the world has been changed dramatically. Gone is the level-esque structure of Saga and the classic square-styled world map of Gears. Instead, you can now seamlessly explore the entire world. It's semi-open world, if you will. Xenoblade 1 has one of my favorite settings out of any video game. The idea of exploring the corpses of these 2 giants perpetually locked in battle is genius to me, and the world really sells that feeling. From almost any place on the Bionis, you can see the Mechonis' sword looming above you, and it seriously sells you on the world this game is creating. Even more impressive is that they've managed to make this work not just on the Wii but the 3DS as well. It helps that almost every location is extremely vibrant with iconic landscapes that are immediately recognizable. That is until you reach the Mechonis where everything looks the fucking same. But I digress. Probably to compensate for the world being this massive and open, they also added the ability to save anywhere anytime, which is very much appreciated. With the gameplay out of the way, let's talk a bit about the audio side of things. Xenoblade 1 has quite possibly one of the best English dubs to any JRPG. It's so good that replaying the games in Japanese felt extremely wrong to me. Adam Howden absolutely kills it as Shulk, and generally the British accents of the cast fit the world pretty damn well. And then there's the music. Holy shit, the music's good. It's no secret that the series has generally had some pretty amazing soundtracks, but even amongst them, Xenoblade 1 is an outlier. Neither Kajiura nor Mitsuda were involved in this game. Instead, there were a variety of composers, namely Manami Kiyota, the music production trio Ace Plus, and Yoko Shimomura. Probably due to it not being a Xeno game until the later stages of production, most of the music doesn't follow the traditions set by the previous games. While it is there in some songs, the Celtic influence is nowhere near as prevalent as in Gears or Saga, and especially Shimomura's tracks feel extremely out of place for the series. Now don't get me wrong, I love her work, I'd argue most people do, and this game is no exception, but it really doesn't sound like a Xeno soundtrack most of the time. This is only made worse by the remastered soundtrack in the Definitive Edition. Now, full disclosure, you can freely swap between the original and remastered tracks at any time. However, the remastered tracks are just flat out worse. I don't know how to really put it, but most of the tracks just try to sound too epic, I suppose. It loses a lot of the bombastic energy the original soundtrack had. A good example being An Obstacle in Our Path. That aside, the music is still all around fantastic. Since exploring this massive world is such a major part of the game, having these longer, much more relaxed tracks accompanying the exploration is a very welcome decision. In Gears and Saga 1 especially, the area music was generally pretty short, which could very quickly get irritating, and thankfully that is no longer an issue. For as much shit as I have given the game, it is a genuinely extremely enjoyable experience to just walk across the Bionis seeing these beautiful landscapes accompanied by the soundtrack, which really helps set the mood and reminds you that this isn't some insane space epic about the meaning of life or whatever, but an adventure about people trying to get by in a world that kinda wants everyone dead. Until you get to the second half of the game, all of a sudden it becomes a Xeno game, which is an experience only made more visceral by the changes in Definitive Edition, retroactively fitted into the game for the sake of properly making it a part of the larger Xeno narrative. For reasons that will become apparent later, I'll keep talking about the story segments to the spoiler section of the video at the end. However, let's talk about the characters. Now, since this was originally not a Xeno game, there are some characters who don't particularly fit into a pre-established archetype, however, most very much do belong to one or another, be it coincidentally or not. Shulk is very clearly this game's contact, though whereas literally every other one is reluctant to fight and does it more so to protect others, Shulk is out for blood, fueled almost entirely by revenge for most of the game, and also he's robo-racist. And if this sounds like it's going into the direction of a different archetype as well, keep that to yourself for now. He also takes the form of the Yuzuki archetype, by virtue of his know-how with machines. Ryan is the story's Fatima, serving as a comedic wingman to the contact capable of being serious when needed. Fiora is the antitype combined with the Kazim, Dunban is the Uzuki and the Bandera stand-in, serving as both a mentor and the voice of reason and calm judgment of the party, Melia is the Magus, Charla is the gunslinger, and Riki is the Antichrist. And while I would love to say that every single one of them is extremely likable, and as well fleshed out as their Saga counterparts, I simply can't. Charla and Riki could be written out of the story entirely, and barring a scene or two, barely anything would need to be changed. And Melia gets barely enough screen time to do anything of note. Her entire arc revolves more around the people who shaped her than it does about herself. They tried to mitigate this in Future Connected, but we'll talk about how that worked out, or rather didn't, once we get to that game. I can respect that they actually tried to make Charla more relevant again later on in the story, but it is an attempt that does kind of fall flat if you ask me, as it is genuinely the only time she ever gets relevant after she joins the party. Likewise, Melia is a very important character, but only thanks to the people around her, and I genuinely wish they'd done more with her as an actual character. The characters in general really are a big reason why the game is so fondly remembered, and rightly so, because the ones that do actually get fleshed out really shine, which is only strengthened by the heart-to-hearts. Every now and then in the world you come across spots where the characters will be able to take a break and just talk with one another, often unrelated to the main story, but it helps flesh them out as more than just characters in a play. It helps make even the underutilized party members like Riki feel like an actual part of the world, and it genuinely makes me wish that some of these were a part of the main story as well. All around, I do like Xenoblade, I really do. Or at least I like most aspects of it. I really like the music, I really like the world, the characters, the story, but actually playing through the game is a genuine chore. I wouldn't even mind it as much if the gameplay part of things involved more than the occasional QTE. As we'll see later on, this will get better, but this is still the basis of all games that follow. So while on one hand I can't say I actually like playing the game, there's still a damn good reason for why it became a cult classic in the first place. And because it wouldn't be a Xeno game without one, Xenoblade 2 ended up receiving its own perfect works. As per usual, this book contains a shit ton of world building, concept art, character information, a glossary, and even a collection of the scripts to most of the heart-to-hearts in the game. I highly recommend reading this if you like the original game and would like to learn more about what went into its creation. In spite of its niche status, Xenoblade 1 sold pretty fucking well all things considered, and so Takahashi and his team decided it was time to return to full-on sci-fi. They gave themselves several guidelines when first creating this game, such as minimizing the amount of time the players spent bored. They also wanted to make sure to encourage active criticism, as, I quote Takahashi here, "After Xenoblade Chronicles was released, there weren't all that many negative opinions that he encountered online. Take that in whatever way you will." 3 years of development later, and the world was given Xenoblade X. Many people like to describe this game as a single-player MMO, and you know what? That couldn't be any more true. This is simultaneously the game's greatest strength and biggest weakness. The world is gigantic, I'm talking 5 times the size of Xenoblade 1's world, which was already pretty damn massive. And one of the biggest selling points of the game was that you were said to be able to explore this entire world while piloting your very own customizable mech. I have to come clean and admit something here, I don't like open world games very much, which is to say they bore me. However, a world as massive as XPX's would have been perfect for online play. Imagine exploring all of these locales and running into other players along the way, helping out in fights and having a great time with friends. The game already plays just like a traditional MMO after all. You have your own fully customizable character and the gameplay was left pretty much unchanged from the first game. However, they did remove chain attacks. You have a run button now, fights are ever so slightly faster in pace, and there's approximately 10% more QTEs for arts than there were before. Hell, in this game you even automatically respawn after 30 seconds when you die instead of just being sent back to the last checkpoint or autosave or whatever. Now, Final Fantasy XII has essentially the same kind of combat system, but so do FF11 and 14, both of which being actual MMOs, so adding a multiplayer component to XPX seems like a no-brainer, right? I'd think so at least. And it does in fact have a multiplayer component. However, it comes with an ever so slight teeny weeny really major issue. You can only do select squad missions online. There's no meeting random players in the world, no progressing the story with your friends, just you, your nameless avatar, and a world that is an absolute chore to explore, for reasons we'll get into shortly. Now I love games like Phantasy Star Online, even in an offline single player environment, however the reason why those games work, even on your own, is the way missions are structured. Xenoblade X is as if you've taken Final Fantasy XIV with triple the map size and absolutely none of the player interaction. A large part as to why MMOs are so popular is the ability to get together with friends and play through a story together, being able to help each other out during it and experiencing it at the same time. Another is the constant stream of player interaction. A world as big as this one simply needs people running around it to make it feel lived in. Now I understand that Mira is a desolate and hostile planet and that humans are simply trying to survive there. But it doesn't make the world any less tedious to explore. And now it's time to talk about why. Remember that awesome mech the entire game was advertised around? Now this game has a total of 12 chapters. You don't get your mech, or skell as they call it in game, until after chapter 6. Past what the game itself considers to be its halfway point, and after that you don't get to fly in it until doing a side quest only available after chapter 9. Assuming you do this, you get a total of 3 story chapters where you can actually explore the world as it was advertised, and you know what? It's fun. It's really fucking fun. Being able to fly from point A to point B is fucking awesome, yet you're busy spending more than 70% of the game walking or driving around on land. What doesn't help is that the camera flat out fucking sucks. It's extremely slow and irritating even on the fastest setting. The controls are also just really weird. On-foot movement feels super slippery and awkward, and it's especially bad when driving around in a skell. There's like a really noticeable delay between pressing the button and letting go of it in anything outside of combat, and the character actually reacting to it. But enough about complaining about the gameplay. For now, let's do something I won't do for any other game in the series and have a talk about the story for a bit, or rather, the lack thereof. Now, I'm not saying that there is none at all, but it is an extremely messy affair. So from the top, as per usual with Xeno, Earth is just gone now, and so instead the entire game takes place on an alien planet known as Mira, where the only city to ever have contributed to humanity's peanut economy in a substantial way has decided to rebuild human civilization. Los Angeles. Yeah, and honestly for the most part that is it. You play as Cross, a man gifted with a unique power. He can jump higher than any white person ever recorded in history. There are some interesting parts to the story, but I'll keep what's relevant to the spoiler section. But truth be told, it is extremely inconsequential. The best way I can describe this game's plot is all setup, no payoff. It reminds me a lot of the way Xenosaga 1's story played out, especially since the game ends on not 1 but 2 cliffhangers, to which we'll likely never get an answer to. Again, more on that in the spoiler section. Where Saga 1 had a pretty substantial cast of characters that helped flesh out the world and story, Blade X has like 3 characters of note, and Cross isn't even one of them by virtue of being a nameless, faceless self-insert. There are a shit ton of other characters you could theoretically recruit, and they do get a bit of personality in their respective affinity quests, but outside of that, they may as well not exist. Same with large parts of the story and world building. The majority of it is relegated entirely to side quest content, and that leads me to what is far and away my biggest problem with this game. The main story progression system is absolute fucking garbage. At almost every single part of the main story, the game will just roadblock you from taking the next story mission until you meet a certain set of requirements, and those can range anywhere from fill out this much percentage of this part of the map and do this specific side quest to collect this much of item X and please max out this specific character's skill tree on your main character. It's tedious, it's frustrating, and most of all, it's wasting my fucking time. If you would, at the very fucking least, let me do the side quests with friends, then it wouldn't even be so bad, but nope, you're on your own, bucko, have fun. The early game is fucking awful and the mid game is only slightly better, but still not all too fun. But the end game, and especially the post game, are really fucking fun. Once you've cleared the story and have all the options available, you can have a great time, because you're not being held back by arbitrary bullshit roadblocks anymore. For instance, there's this class system where you can select one of several progressive jobs, all with their own weapons and playstyles, grouped into attack, defense, and support. No healers this time, because Takahashi allegedly thought people would find playing as a healer fucking boring, but I digress. In the main campaign, you're somewhat encouraged to experiment with the different classes and try out as many as you want, but because of how awfully tedious progression in the story can be, it's not exactly ideal. In the post-game though, none of these restrictions apply and you're free to play whatever class you feel like and just drop it at any time without coming to regret it 4 missions later. I genuinely love how fun the post-game can be sometimes, and I can definitely see how some MMO fanatics could end up spending hundreds upon hundreds of hours in it just for fun. But man, the actual road to getting there can be downright nightmarish sometimes. Aesthetically speaking, we've dropped the Western-inspired style of Xenoblade 1 and returned to a more anime-esque style, which fits far more in line with the other games in the series, helped by the fact that Kunihiko Tanaka returned as the character designer, with Choco coming back to the mech design, just like it was back in Saga 1 and 2. And you can call me biased, but I think the game looks good. I know the character models get clowned on a lot, but I genuinely think that a lot of the environments can be downright gorgeous, even rivaling some areas in the other Blade games. And then there's the music. If there ever was anything controversial in the Blade series, it's the music in X. And you know what? I'll say it the way it is, the music in this game is fucking awesome. None of the prior games' composers were involved with this one, and even Takahashi took a step back and let the composer do his own thing entirely. Said composer being Hiroyuki Sawano. He seems to be a pretty big deal in the anime music industry, but I don't know the first thing about that. But what I do know is that his music in this game is fucking awesome. I know I'm saying this for 2 games in a row, but this soundtrack is unlike anything else in the franchise. Almost all of it consists of these loud and bombastic industrial tracks, though never forgetting the Xeno signature Celtic influence when apt. What sets this soundtrack apart from all the others in the series is the fact that most of the songs here have lyrics, not just a credits theme. Mind you, none of the lyrics are written by Takahashi, and they can get delightfully fucking stupid. But some of them are also just straight up fucking beautiful. Songs like Uncontrollable rival some of the best tracks in the franchise. So if you're one of those frankly stupid people who turned off the music volume while playing the game, I implore you to give the OST a listen outside of the game sometime. Ignore the lyrics and just enjoy the music for what it is. I promise you, you will not be disappointed. I'll also be linking some of my personal favorite tracks in the description. That, however, sums up about everything I have to say about Xenoblade X. A game that can be as frustrating as it can be fun, and simultaneously test your patience until it reaches the brink. The first thing I left out is more or less its own thing entirely, so I'm giving it its own category. Leading up to the original game's Japanese release, the official Japanese Xenoblade X website was frequently updated to host several short stories that take place before Cross wakes up. As always, I'll have a link to the translation of the entire site as well as the original page in the description. Much like most of the Blade series and some of the Saga site materials, they were written by Yuichiro Takeda. The issue is that, just like the game they're a prequel to, these stories are painfully uninteresting. The writing is still stiff, the characters devoid of any personality, and the scenarios uninteresting. Just about the only purpose they serve is to enhance the world building. They're there if you care about that kind of thing, but if you're playing Blade X for the story, I think you have bigger problems to deal with. Now for the game itself. While it's mostly remained the same, there are quite a few changes that do definitely make this a much better experience. For one, the game looks really pretty now. I've always been of the opinion that the original Blade X looked great environmentally, but now it's even prettier. The game generally resembles Saga Freaks' art style now, which I do quite like, but the character models unfortunately are still a total mess, and no matter what you do, Cross still looks like shit. And even then, that's not really consistent. Despite the graphical enhancements, the art style shift is pretty noticeable, and the game ends up getting a completely different vibe because of it. There's actually a funny thing going on where some characters have significantly more detailed textures than others. It's actually pretty jarring, all things considered. The camera is way better now though, so are the controls for the skill. It's still slippery as shit, don't get me wrong, but it's become a lot more manageable. I think you now also jump a little higher, increasing the Caucasoid maximum jump height ever so slightly, but I'm not going to take out my Wii U again just to test that. Some tracks also got remixes, which sound a bit fuller, I guess, and in the case of the flight theme, you get to choose between the original track, the new one, and the version without vocals. They also made the game significantly more single-player friendly, by having all of the online-only stuff be available through offline as well. By far the best change in my opinion though has to be the removal of the blade leveling system. Originally, aside from just needing to grind out levels, money, and Myranium to fund Lockheed Martin, which we'll get to in a bit, you also needed to grind out your overall blade level, which was necessary to unlock more quests and material, as well as leveling up your field skills. All around, it was a dogshit system, and I'm glad it's gone. But the last big things that are added are that the level cap has been raised from 60 to 99, and the addition of quick cooldown. Xenoblade X has always had an incredibly intricate, albeit really obtuse and very abusable combat system that I honestly didn't give enough credit in my original video. I'd put it about on par with Xenoblade 2 in terms of complexity. The classes and soul voice systems allow for a shocking amount of player expression, and once you reach the post-game, one of the most fun things to do is to just abuse the ever-living shit out of the system to turn Cross into an unstoppable death god. These changes allow you to go even further beyond. Raising the level cap is pretty self-explanatory, but quick cooldown is a mechanic that lets you use a rechargeable resource, similar to the tension meter, which you use to go into overdrive and revive dead allies, to instantly reuse any arts that are currently on cooldown. At first it only works on foot, so scale fights still have all the same issues as before, but since ground combat overshadowing the mech fights has somehow always been C's tradition, this doesn't really go anywhere or change all that much, but in the post-game, scales get it too. Combat's always been the highlight of this game, and they've made it even better. Unfortunately, they didn't try to salvage anything else in this game. It still remains a single-player MMO that really shouldn't have been. All the multiplayer content is still relegated to just standalone raid missions. The maps are still incredibly empty and a chore to traverse on foot, and most importantly, it's still an absolute grindfest thanks to its progression systems. Want to progress the main story? Please painstakingly fill out X% of the map or fulfill Y random conditions. Want to get better gear? Please engage with this dogshit mining system where you just connect several nodes of the same probes to each other so you can mine Myranium that you can invest into different manufacturers, of which Sakuraba really should be the only one that you invest in at the start, because that way you can get level 50 scales as soon as you unlock them. It's extremely tiresome unless you just straight up enjoy the act of roaming around the world itself, which at least on foot, I don't, and I never did. Obviously I wasn't expecting them to overhaul the entire game, that would have been ridiculous and more effort than it's worth, and they honestly improved more than I expected them to begin with, but these are still very much issues with the game on a whole, and they're just as present here as they were on Wii U. And then of course you have the story itself. There have been virtually no changes whatsoever from the original for what was already there in the game, which unfortunately means that the writing's still incredibly stiff, the narrative's still extremely subpar, the character's still completely unlikable, and the world's still thoroughly left unexplored narratively outside of a trillion of side quests. Narratively, Takahashi had virtually no involvement with this game, and without spoiling anything, that hasn't changed for any of the new content. And it really shows. The story is seriously the last thing you should be playing this game for, and it's even more true from this version than the original. Other than that, all of the remaining big additions all come in the form of completely new content, which, since the game is still relatively new, I will be having in their own coming up gameplay spoiler section separate from the story spoiler one. This will only show visual gameplay spoilers, I won't be taking anything narratively away or whatever, but if you still don't want to see that, just jump to the timestamp on screen to skip both. Holy shit, the new content was dog shit. The two new party members really aren't worth the headache that is getting them. And the Hersvelg, aside from being visually really cool, and despite being completely and utterly disconnected from what it was supposed to be in the original narrative, is not fun for anything except for getting around by virtue of not being able to change its arts. So that's like half the appeal of this game's combat gone. And then there's the new area. I straight up hated this place. It's a giant collection of floating landmasses surrounded by a million enemies that will attack you on sight, some of which will follow you halfway across the map. And because of that, it's a genuine chore to navigate. What doesn't help is that while you can technically just ignore everything and go straight for the final goal in this chapter, you're really not gonna want to do that unless you've already turned Cross into a death machine. So instead you end up essentially chasing needles in a haystack, trying to scour every nook and cranny of these relatively broad radiuses they give you on the minimap, where a certain thing you're going to want to collect are at. What doesn't help is that once you're in this area, you can also just not leave until you're done. And the highest level enemy here is 60, so if you want to level up, it's a huge chore. What doesn't help is that this area has a new exclusive battle theme, and it doesn't fit with the rest of the soundtrack at all. I don't think it's made by Sawano, as it doesn't at all sound like any of the other stuff he's made, and more so sounds like something you'd hear in a Sonic game. Don't believe me? Here's some proof. The big new enemy in the story chapters, the ghosts, also just a genuine chore to fight. You can only damage them on their glowing weak spot, which isn't just an annoying target, but sometimes your party members will just completely ignore it no matter what you tell them to do. And they'll be attacking its body, accomplishing absolutely nothing. It gets especially bad when they make you fight multiple at once, because you're forced to take them on one by one without any variation, because your party members straight up refuse to find the weak spots themselves. Having to babysit the AI was already a massive issue in the original, but with the ghosts it's so much worse now. That's pretty much all I have to say about about the new gameplay content. So from here on out, it's all spoilers for the new story content. Obviously this is also going to tie into the original Xenoblade X narrative, but also the Xenoblade trilogy and the entirety of Xenosaga. If you don't want to see me talk about that, then skip to the timestamp on screen to jump to my closing thoughts on this remaster. Making you find all of your party members one by one again was a really cool idea conceptually, but in practice it's such a chore because Volataris just straight up isn't fun to traverse. They also had a perfect opportunity to answer any questions raised by the original, like Cross's amnesia, and they just chose to completely ignore it outside of a joke. And the final boss is just, oh my god, it's awful. You're basically forced to use your scout because this fight is a DPS check more than anything, and every now and then he'll try to escape, and the only way to stop him is by binding him with your skill. So if it breaks during the fight, you better hope you can kill him fast enough. God, it's such a dumb mechanic. When I finished the game, I was currently streaming it to some friends, and after hysterically laughing our asses off at the genuinely atrocious dialogue, once the final cutscene ended, I paused the game, and I said to them, that was quite possibly one of the most offensive endings I have ever seen in a video game. Let's take it from the top. The new story content was all of the exact same bullshit as the base game. Unlikable characters, forced-feeling dialogue, and just plain bad writing. Hell, sometimes I thought the writing was worse than in the original. They didn't even add a cutscene viewer, so for some fucking reason, you have to replay the entirety of chapter 13 if you want to see all of the scenes. I don't want to do that, so you're gonna have to live with screenshots of things I'm talking about sometimes. But lines like, your earth accepted me with all the compassion of a place your people rightly call their mother, feel so stiff that I have to wonder if AI was involved in writing them. I also cannot begin to explain how legitimately upset I am at how they completely gutted all of the original concepts for the game. The Black Knight was very clearly a testament. His design in the art book was awesome, and the Resveld was supposed to be his Skell. Yet here it is, given some random, completely new missable side character who sucks. Because fuck you. We don't even get any real conclusion to the cliffhangers in the original game because all of the Lifehold core shit is very quickly forgotten about in favor of the all new problems. And Lao never actually survived and instead ended up in purgatory, where he vanishes shortly after anyway. Instead, we get Elma's old partner. Aside from being nothing like the art book described him, Alois is also the corniest motherfucker of all time. And he brings with him the worst twist in the franchise. Welcome to the fucking multiverse. The way that they explain the multiverse is so unnecessarily corny, and it was kind of upsetting. They could have just left it at, oh, this is an alternate reality and some of the things from it also happen to happen in the main timeline, which honestly would have been much better. Or maybe they could have made a UMN simulation like I originally theorized in my older video. Both of these would have been fine. But instead we now have 4 separate timelines because we needed to force this into the main timeline somehow. The Xenogears timeline, the Xenosaga and Blade main timeline, the timeline in which Earth is destroyed by the ghosts in the intro of X, and the timeline in which all of X takes place. From the moment the game started toying with the idea of getting the cast to jump across into a different dimension in order to escape theirs being destroyed, I was continuously dreading them crossing over to the main timeline. And when they eventually did, I was hit like a truck by the realization that this will be the plot of Xenoblade 4. All of this on its own is already bad, sure, but it's inoffensive, if really stupid. The part that pissed me off was how they continuously tied it into Xenosaga. Oh my god. The ghosts are just this reality's equivalent of the Gnosis. Fine. They function pretty much the same and have the same abilities. The main villain and their leader, Void, is basically just an alternate reality counterpart of Urief, being an evil scientist driven mad by the contact with Zohar and gaining an obsession with an aspect of godhood. Unrelated addendum, but is it just me or does his true form kind of look like Azura? Also, Lao Giga Chat bottom text. The worst part is the ending cutscene. When I saw the scene with the dancing figure in front of the Zohar silhouette with the white feathers coming towards the screen, I realized something. That's Nephilim after the ending of Saga 3, with all of the Xenosaga feather imagery, and I was already upset at how forced this was. But then they follow it up with Alois just straight up talking about heaven, and then they copy-paste the ending of Xenosaga 3 like it's earned. It might as well be a one-to-one copy at this point, and essentially spits all over the impact that that ending had, and reveal that Blade took place on Lost Jerusalem all along. You seriously mean to tell me that there's a non-zero chance KOS-MOS is going to bump into these cardboard cutouts like it's the Elsa introduction scene in Saga 1 while she's falling to Earth? I genuinely never want to see any of these characters again, but at this point I've just kind of come to terms with the fact that I will. It's greatly upsetting, and you can really tell that Takahashi didn't have much involvement in the plot, because if he did, Jesus Christ, what the fuck are you doing, dude? But hey, if there's a silver lining, then it's that Future Redeemed made Rex likable. So here's hoping that Monolith can make a miracle happen again and make the cast of X also likable. And if not, then I hope that the moment they land on Earth, the Elsa crashes headfirst into them, killing everyone on board instantly. That would be nice. But as it stands, all of this has genuinely made Blade X go from a game that I thought was cool, albeit extremely flawed across the board and loved wasting your time, to born on my most hated Xeno game to date. And I now owe every Blade 2 fan a heartfelt apology. I know I called Xenosaga 2 the worst Perfect Works game, but Xenoblade 2 is far and away my least favorite. I apologize in advance if this segment devolves into a lot of complaining. History repeating itself has always been a main theme throughout these games, so I find it particularly funny that the Blade and Saga series parallel each other so much. The first game was completely uncharted territory for the team, and the result ended up being pretty decent, albeit very flawed. Then for the second game, Takahashi decided to take hands-off approach, whilst the smaller team, in this case of 40 people, worked on it actively, and that resulted in an absolute mess. But you know what? Before this devolves into a rant, let's talk about what this game does well, because they certainly do exist, namely the combat. Fundamentally speaking, the gameplay is much better than the original. Whilst the core ideas are still intact, arts now recharge depending on how many auto attacks you land, as opposed to simply recharging over time. Your characters also now consist of pairs of a driver and a blade, with the driver deciding the base stats and affinities, and the blade deciding the moveset. You can bring up to 3 blades per driver into battle, and you can swap them out at any time once their cooldown is over. To compensate for this, you can now only equip up to 3 arts per blade, now mapped to the respective face buttons. And the talent art is always blade specific. Not only does this streamline the game by a lot, but it also makes it significantly less annoying than having to cycle through every art with the D-pad. If you use your talent arts right, you can now also put elemental orbs onto enemies, which you can then break during chain attacks by using the opposite element, which deals insane damage, and if you kill an enemy during a chain attack and beat their shit in some more, you get overkill, which is functionally identical to finish strikes from Saga 3. And you know what? I'm not gonna bother explaining the combat more, because this actually leads me to my first complaint with this game. There are an insane amount of tutorial pop-ups all the way to the end of the game, and yet despite that, the game fails at teaching you any of its mechanics properly. There's a damn good reason why the average length of a Xenoblade 2 combat explanation on YouTube is about 10 fucking minutes long. This is the exact same problem that Saga 2 had. Lots of tutorials for an overly complicated system, but nothing is actually explained. And that really sucks, because once you understand the systems that the game has, it can be really fucking fun. Or, well, it could. The reason why it isn't is because nothing in the main game at any point ever encourages you to actually play with the mechanics, because just a handful of orb break chains are enough to completely decimate every single enemy. It isn't even until you reach the post-game content like the level 100 plus super bosses or the challenge battles that you actually get to play with the mechanics of the game. But you know what? Since we're already here, let's talk about what is quite possibly the biggest fucking sin this game commits. Do you all know what a gacha is? I've talked about them before in the Phantasy Star videos, but basically it's a system commonly used in mobile games, where you use an in-game currency to randomly roll for new characters to use. And for some godforsaken reason, Monolith decided that that's a system that the game definitely needed. The drop rates are completely demented, and the system is tied to the only other system in this game bad enough to rival it. Fucking field skills. This is one of the worst game mechanics ever invented. Every now and again, the game will just arbitrarily roadblock you somewhere and skill check you on the abilities of your currently equipped blade. Let's take Pyra. Pyra's element is fire, so she has fire field skills, and you can use them to fucking cook or burn down the path, right? Well, no. Not unless you deal with the completely stupid affinity system to level up their skills to the necessary system. Raising a blade's affinity involves giving them their favorite food, using them in battle, sucking them off, or gaslighting them with a DLC item, which basically instantly raises their affinity to maximum. Because this is a pay-to-win game. We'll get to this later. Now, sometimes these skill checks demand you to use skills that your current story blades don't have. So you're forced to grind core crystals to roll for random blades, hoping you get one that has what you need, easily unlockable, so you can progress. This is the most insulting form of padding. All it does is waste your time. And since we're at it, let's talk about the blades for a bit. There's basic blades of all types and elements there to do nothing but waste your time and fill out the pool of uselessness this game loves to fly around. The important ones are the rare blades, which are actually named characters. They get their own side quests and backstory and have unique skills and abilities that actually make them worth using. And these are a perfect showcase of what is easily the biggest problem with this game's visuals. It's not the insane amount of texture popping, nor is it the fact that the game is basically unplayable on handheld mode, it's the insane art style clash prominent all over the fucking game. There were a total of 27 character designers for this game. The main party was designed by Masatsugu Saito, and the main antagonist group by Tetsuya Nomura. And you know what? If it makes Takahashi happy to finally work with Nomura after all these years, then fine, but those two should have been enough. But nope, because every other blade was designed by one of the other 25 people. Now, this did lead to a couple of cool things. For instance, Soraya Saga designed one of them, which makes this the first and only time she's worked on the series since Saga 2. However, what's really cool is that they decided to put characters from older Xeno games in. Kunihiko Tanaka came back to redesign KOS-MOS, giving her the worst design she's ever had. Though, he also came back to design Elma, Shulk, and Fiora in the DLC. Meanwhile, Choco redesigned Telos, giving her Shion's old glasses, and I highly approve of this. Just a small issue though, they also designed all new blades. Choco's designs are actual shit, and I refuse to elaborate, I think you can see them. But Tanaka ended up drawing a choo-choo, but a bird. And that's a fact that I've lost sleep over, but I digress. So why did I call this game Pay to Win? Well, the DLC introduced several new blades, and all of them are completely overpowered to the point where they could easily solo the game. I just want to point out that the strongest character in this game was designed by the Sword Art Online artist. Make of this what you will. The DLC also introduced the Love Potion, which can easily be crafted and completely negates the need to grind for affinity points. How fun! With the combat out of the way, let's talk about the world a bit. Instead of the massive world of Xenoblade 1, Alrest is split into several smaller locations, probably to compensate for the fact that the team have no fucking idea how the Switch's hardware works. These still have some extremely pretty cool landmarks, and it's very cool seeing the Titans move in the distance, but ultimately a lot of them just aren't nearly as interesting as much of what the Bionis or even areas in Blade X had to offer, even though you can tell that the team tried their hardest. The Sea of Clouds is especially cool. Instead of being an instant death zone, it actually lets you swim around, though falling into it with no teleporting location nearby can be pretty annoying. And then there's the dungeons. I really don't like them. A lot of them simply involve going from point X to point W to get item Z to activate mechanism Y at point X, and you do this like 3 times per dungeon. It's lazy, and I'd really rather have something like the open exploration of Blade 1 or the occasional puzzles of Saga 3. Now that I've complained your ears off about the gameplay, let's talk about the characters and story for a bit, alright? This game has by far the slowest opening in the series. You start off with this beautiful shot of the Sea of Clouds, but that barely lasts and doesn't even get you immediately hooked like the Eldritch Crash in Gears or the Battle of Sword Valley in Blade. Granted, Saga 1's opening was also very slow, and then for the solid next hour you just run around doing chores and getting prepared for your job doing a boring QTE minigame. It's really like nothing happens, and it kind of sets the tone for everything to come. You can really tell that each chapter was written by a different writer, and the story has a lot of moments where the characters just run around doing something completely arbitrary to pad out the runtime. I can't name the amount of time until chapter 7, where the current main story objective simply involves running around to an arbitrary location for what really should have been a side quest. But then you get to the final few chapters actually written by Takahashi, and all of a sudden the game gets good, and it's almost enough to make everything worth it. It makes me wish that the entire game was like that. And then there's the characters. Horrible character designs aside, I really don't like this cast. Rex is by far the most unlikable contact in the series. I get that he's supposed to be this immature kid who has to grow up, but his journey is just not compelling, and he comes across as annoying more than anything else. Pyra and Mithra are both antitype and complement, as well as the Kasim for reasons I'll discuss more later. Nia is also the antitype and Kasim combined, but she also has a bit of the Magus in her. Morak takes the mentor role of the Yuzuki and the stoicism of the Menderes, with an importance to the story as grand as Timothy from Gears. Zeke is literally just Bart mixed with Sigurd, even his DLC alt color is just straight up Bart. He's the only good character in this party, because I'm biased. And then lastly there is Tora. I wish to see Tora boiled alive until the flesh melts off his skin. I don't know who had the idea to make this game's choo-choo equivalent a lolicon weeb, but whoever they are, I want them fired this fucking instant. What does not help is that he is the strongest driver in the game bar none. If you build Poppy's final form, whose name I refuse to say, right, she becomes a fucking killer machine that can solo super bosses even while severely underleveled. All it takes is some hours of grinding, one of the worst minigames, no, scratch that, the worst minigame in the franchise. Tiger, if you like this minigame, we cannot be friends. On the villain side, I'd for now like to focus on 2 characters. Malos is basically this game's Grahf equivalent, and he steals the show every scene he's in. His English voice actor is hilarious. The dude just shows up sometimes, fucks shit up, swears, and leaves. The other is Jin. Not only does he take his name from Jin Uzuki, but he's essentially just an inversion of Jin mixed with some parts of Margulis. And in spite of the fact that he so blatantly rips off many aspects of Jin Uzuki, he fails to make them work. His story fundamentally misunderstands what makes Saga's Jin so compelling. And whilst he is still one of the best characters in this game, he ends up feeling like little more than a shallow copy. For now, that's as far as I'm willing to talk about the story outside of the spoiler section, so we'll definitely get back to this later. If nothing else, the music is fucking beautiful. Yasunori Mitsuda has returned to the franchise and is here to stay, as one of the composers as well as one of the soundtrack producers, and thanks to him, things like the Celtic influence are back in full force, and you know what? Sometimes that is enough to just make me forget that I'm playing Xenoblade 2, as I simply sit back and get immersed in the atmosphere. Xenoblade 2 is one of my least favorite types of games, the it gets good eventually variety, because whilst the first several chapters are atrocious, the final few really are good enough to make it almost all worth it. I'll get back to all of this in the spoiler section though, so for now it's time to move on. Though we're not reaching Xenoblade 3 just yet. As part of the DLC campaign, Xenoblade 2 would end up getting a completely standalone prequel game. And that game kinda fucking rules. I love Torna the Golden Country. It's like a bite-sized version of everything Blade 2 does well, with all the bad parts removed. The combat, for instance, is largely the same. However, the blades are now proper characters. Your party consists of 3 teams, each with 1 driver and 2 blades. Of the 2 blades, only 1 can be used in active battle, but you can still swap them out like in a base game. Unlike there though, you can now actually play as them with their own unique movesets and everything. The passive character in your party gets to attack from behind too, meaning you essentially have an active party of 6 now. Furthermore, the gacha bullshit is completely gone, so you can focus all of your efforts on building the few party members you actually have. This is far and away my favorite combat system in the Blade series, and partly why I like this game so much. Even the roughest of edges in Blade 2 were sanded down, considerably. Field skills, for instance, no longer arbitrarily block your progress, and thank God for that. They also modified the engine so that texture popping in the game is considerably less noticeable than in base game. Art style clash is also no longer a problem since everything actually looks consistent now. Whilst some areas from XP2 do return, namely Gormod, most of the game takes place on the completely new continent of Torna, and man, I love this place. It's extremely fucking pretty and full of memorable landmarks like in Blade 1, with the capital especially setting itself apart by having this clearly Eastern-inspired aesthetic. I also adore how the soundtrack for this game gives everything a certain jazz flair. It works incredibly well, and results in what is easily one of my favorite OSTs in the franchise. Since the game is also much shorter than the average Blade game, this run for instance took me about as long as Xenosaga 2, it results in a short but very sweet experience. But as always, the game does have one major problem. At 2 points in the story, you'll be stopped dead in your tracks until you've reached a certain community level. The first time you get roadblock until reaching level 2, and the second time requires level 4 to progress. The way you increase the community level is through interacting with NPCs and primarily doing side quests. I for one found these to be really enjoyable, but there's no denying that it seriously kills the pace, and some people would really rather just continue on with the story. I think what really carried this system for me was that I honestly really love these characters. Unlike with base Blade 2, I found the party to be great. As always, everyone fits into the classical Xeno archetypes, though for reasons I'll be discussing later in the spoiler segment, this is where these archetypes start to become a little iffy, so just bear with me for now. Laura is a wonderful protagonist and is not the game's contact. It's nice to have someone fresh holding the reins again, and her energetic point of view is really nice. The actual contact this time around is Adam, though he also has a lot of Bart in him. Mithra is still the anti-type mixed with the Kasim, and Jin's still the Yuzuki. Minov takes over as a gunslinger, Hugo is a noble and easily the weakest of the cast, Bridget serves as a good magus, and Hayes is the game's Chucho equivalent, except she's really adorable. And before someone asks, no, I didn't forget Aegeon, the game did. Really, the cast consists of pretty much just Laura, Jin, Adam and Mithra. That's all you really need. The relationships between these 4 characters are fantastic, and seeing them bounce off of the rather simple rest of the cast is an absolute joy. It's why I really enjoyed doing the side quests and why I didn't mind 100%ing the game. All around, I found Torna to be an excellent game, and I really can't help but wish this is what the base game had been like too. But what can you do? You win some, you lose some. Before we move on to Xenoblade 3, let's first go back to the first game and talk about the side story added in the definitive edition, Future Connected. This is an epilogue story to the main game, set approximately a year after it. The only party members to return are Shulk and Melia, though you're accompanied by an army of Napon and 2 of Riki's children who take their movesets from Ryan and Sharla respectively. Gameplay-wise, this game's nearly identical to Xenoblade 1, but the only noteworthy differences are that there are no more visions, and that chain attacks are replaced with the Napon army beating the ever-living shit out of your enemies. I don't really have much to say about this one outside of the story stuff in the spoiler section, to be honest. Most of the game takes place on the Baroness's shoulder, which is a cut location from the first game, and that is really cool, but it's also pretty boring. Basically nothing happens here. Shulk was flanderized quite a bit because he shouldn't be here to begin with, and now he's just the tech guy. And Melia's role in the story is completely underutilized. Whilst the few noteworthy things that do happen are pretty cool, they are very few and far between. Though to be fair, the thing is barely 7 hours long. I still can't help to wish there was a bit more to it though. Sure, it's cool that some side quests follow up on ones from the main game, and the music is as usual fantastic. Like holy shit, the Fog Beast battle theme is amazing. But ultimately this side story serves more as a setup for even more setup in Xenoblade 3. But with that serving as a perfect transition, I'd say it's about time we move on. On the day that I am recording this, it has been exactly 1 year since Xenoblade 3 was first released. Since then, I've seen opinions change on it drastically. Whilst I can definitely see why the game ended up getting much more criticism down the line as opposed to at launch, I still firmly stand by the belief that this is not only the best of the main Xenoblade trilogy, but one of the best Xeno games period. Once again, let's start with the gameplay changes. Since Blade 3 is supposed to be a combination of 1 and 2, it makes sense that they'd make the gameplay be a follow-up of the same theme. During combat, you now have two types of arts, ones that refill over time, like in Blade 1, and ones that refill with each hit, like in 2. Talent arts, on the other hand, still function like in 2, where things get really interesting is in its unique mechanics. Whereas the first game lets you equip up to 8 arts and 2 only let you have 3 per blade, 3 lets you set up 6 of them, whereas 3 are mapped to the face buttons and the other 3 to the D-pad. Your party is also split into 3 pairs, all of which can then fuse into Ouroborus form, which are this game's gear equivalents. Yep, they're back. More on this later. Once the form is charged up, you can turn into it. Basically, this is a temporary super mode where you get a set moveset with whatever passives you've unlocked. You can take damage while in Ouroborus form, however, it gradually heats up, so you want to make sure to dish out as much damage as possible while in this form, especially because of something we'll get into shortly. The other big change is chain attacks. Gone is the weird orb bullshit from 2. Instead, you try to keep a chain going as much as you can by using your party's unique passives, certain skill effects, and the 3 different job categories, all of which can be affected by certain equipment. And if you're in Ouroborus form while starting it, you can cap the chain attack off with a fat Ouroborus combo attack that dishes out some extremely beefy damage. Combine this with the topple, launch, smash combos, and you can deal some ludicrous amounts of damage. Trust me when I say that you'll definitely need that. Again, more on this in a bit. This is far and away the best chain attack system in the series, especially since Overkill returns. And then there's by far my favorite system they added: jobs. I'm talking Final Fantasy V type jobs. I'm a massive sucker for these systems, so I may just be biased, but it can't be helped. There's healers, tanks, attackers, buffers, debuffers, healers that do damage, attackers with an elemental focus, tanks that are borderline immortal. You get the idea. Furthermore, every job comes with an associated character who joins your party as a hero. Heroes are essentially an additional 7th party member you can tag along, and they range anywhere from completely overpowered to absolutely useless. And just like in FF5, leveling up a job on a certain character allows them to permanently gain moves and passives associated with that job. Fundamentally, this is a really good combat system. So then why is it that bosses are the biggest fucking damage sponges in the franchise? The amount of damage they take to go down is fucking ridiculous sometimes. Field skills are also entirely gone, thank fuck. Instead, you now get abilities throughout the game that gradually allow you to explore more of the world. And my god is it big. Every location is extremely full of iconic landmarks and absolutely beautiful views. Since the world is a combination of the ones from the first 2 games, many of their landmarks are still here, now decrepit and desolate, but very much recognizable. The Mechonis' sword, looking as if it was striking the Orion Titan, is easily one of the most iconic visuals in the game, and the sword is visible from just about anywhere on the map, just like the Mechonis itself was on Bionis. Initially I was worried that progressing in the world might end up being extremely tedious like a lot of times in 2, where sometimes I'd just be walking around for hours looking for the next objective as the obvious path is arbitrarily roadblocked. Thankfully, they remedy this by giving you the Dead Space where the fuck do I go button. That just shows you the fastest possible path to your next active objective. Xenoblade X had something similar, but pretty annoying to use. Thanks to this, exploration is extremely enjoyable, and you never have to worry about getting lost, and can just take in the excellently designed world at your leisure. Before we continue, I'd also like to point out that the soundtrack is fucking fantastic. Mitsuda is back as a key composer, and is spearheading the music production, and it really shows. The game's soundtrack is significantly more somber than the other games in the series, reminiscent of Saga Free, and whilst a lot of people have considered it to be more boring than the others because of that, I can't help but disagree. I think the soundtrack is very fitting to the overall tone of the game, and really helps to enhance some of its best moments. Hell, even the art style of this game is great. The way Saito designed the characters has mellowed out considerably since Blade 2, and the entire game has a sort of brushstroke aesthetic, and it works extremely well for the Switch. So the gameplay is great, the visuals are great, the music is great, so what is it about this game that people don't like? Well, the answer is easy. See, the game has 7 chapters to its story, and the first 5 are fucking fantastic. However, the story starts to slow down dramatically in the later half, and to a lot of people this is where the game falls off. I'll go into details in the spoiler section, but they're not wrong per se. A lot of loose ends are simply either ignored or completely forgotten about, and unlike Saga Free, where all arcs are resolved and only the future is uncertain, I simply can't say that that's the case here either. I do believe that Blade 3 is a lot smarter than most people give it credit for, but a lot of the criticism is warranted. Again, more on this in the spoiler segment. So while we're at it, let's talk about the characters for a bit. There's always a peace-loving protagonist forced to fight to protect those he cares about, who also suffers from some very clear mental health problems. Their emotional counterpart, who is also just as psychologically screwed, the man who knows a little bit more about the world than most do, hot-headed bronze of the party, teenager with a firearm, the Furby, and lastly, the always composed strong guy with a heart of gold and some serious trauma to process. The story takes place in the middle of a war between two warring nations called Kiev and Agnes, and the main antagonists are a group of masked individuals working under an elusive leader towards an unclear goal, whilst perpetuating said war. And if any of this is giving you a feeling of déjà vu, well, it's you and me both. This game is a celebration of everything Xeno, and I don't mean that just for Blade. I know this is going to sound extremely pretentious, but I genuinely think that if you've played Xenogears, you'll get way more out of this game than if you've played the other Blade games. Hell, I'd call it a legally distinct remake. Though, it's also much more than that. More on this in the spoiler section. The entire game is full of nothing but reverence and love for everything Takahashi has built. A good spoiler-free example of this would be the Ouroborus forms. Being designed by series veteran Choco, you can already imagine them being full of references. Noah's is based on the Weltall, Mio's on KOS-MOS V3, Uni's on Crescens, Senna's on Dina, and so on. And you know what? Maybe I'm just reading into things, but with everything I've seen from the series so far, I find that hard to believe. No, this game was meticulously designed for fans of the series as a whole. Or at least, that's what it feels like to me. It's not perfect by any means. Trust me, I have just as many problems with the game's ending portion as most people. Nor is it even remotely as masterfully written as Saga or as ambitious as Gears. But behind the game is a clear passion for the Xeno series, and that alone is enough to make it my favorite of the Xenoblade main games. But this isn't where the story ends, nor is this my favorite Xenoblade game in general, because this game's DLC is what finally validates this entire journey through the franchise. Future Redeemed is good. Really good. This is hands down the most refined package out of any Blade game. Gameplay wise, it's obviously based on Blade 3, though some changes do exist. For one, heroes and jobs are gone, and the Ouroborus forms were replaced by partner attacks. Said partner attacks are also the only way to finish off a launch combo now, as opposed to regular arts. That's it for combat changes really, but holy shit, exploration has never been better. In this game, to upgrade your characters, you need to use exploration points, or I guess they're called affinity points, which you get by doing just about anything really. Picking up items across the map, finding landmarks, fighting enemies, you actually get rewarded for exploring every nook and crevice for once, as opposed to just finding some rare items or enemies. It's extremely satisfying. A good example of how good this change is the Collectopedia. It's a thing that was in both Xenoblade 1 and X, where if you get all the collectible items in an area, you get a certain reward, like gear or money. In Xenoblade 3, the weird NPC-specific bullshit where some NPCs request you get them some certain items or whatever, and the reward is honestly not worth it. Here on the other hand, you get the skill points that alone makes it a million times more useful. And even outside of this, you're rewarded for your exploration, as you can sometimes find different kinds of kits that unlock special passives for your character pairs, more parts of your skill trees, and so on. And since the game is about as long as Torna, it's actually really fucking fun to 100% it, as crazy as that may sound. But really, the gameplay isn't what you should be playing this game for, the story is. Xenoblade 3 may have been a celebration of everything Xeno, but Future Redeemed is the final nod to everything that makes up perfect works. This is the end of the story as we know it. This game doesn't just tie its own narrative up perfectly, but it finally gives us answers that I've been waiting for over a decade. I'm really getting ahead of myself here, so this is where we're calling it quits for the spoilerless part of the video. From this point onwards, there will be massive spoilers. This spoiler section will be split in two. The first will focus on some spoiler portions for just the Xenoblade games that I've been wanting to talk about. The second, on the other hand, will feature spoilers for not just all of Blade, but the entire franchise. And Future Redeemed sits right in the center of everything. So, for everyone who's hopping off the video now, please play these games. All of them. Then come back here. I promise you that it's all worth it. For everyone else, let's raise the curtain on the final act of this, frankly, too long play. Before we get into trying to tie everything together, let's just talk about the individual Blade games for a bit. For Xenoblade 1, I like the story, I do. I think the characters are really strong, but I certainly do have issues with it. For instance, there's a side story in the secret file where they explain how Fiora got her home's body back. I think that should have just been in the main game. On that note, I think it's a damn shame how they treat Melia. Up until the party saves Fiora, she's supposed to be the main female lead, but they kind of never capitalize on it. This is only made worse by the fact that Fiora completely eclipses her when she does come back. On the other hand, you have Zanza, who does a great job being both a Deus and its stand-in. This guy's seriously menacing, and I wish he was more prevalent in the first half of the story. And man, I hate these cliffhangers in XPX. Not only is it extremely fucking shitty to pull the story never truly ends, but then to have actively contradict everything we've been told up this point and then never following up on it, that's just bullshit. Especially because the Black Knight is clearly a testament, but we'll get into this later. For XP2, I think that the core message of accepting grief as a common part of life is extremely noble and also fits the series very well, and the idea behind Rex as a protagonist is great. My main issue comes from how it's presented. It's a layer underneath so many anime tropes and so much poor comedy, and is held back by a slew of writers, none of whose style really meshes well with that of the others. The scene where Rex tells Nia that he loves her and everybody else is possibly one of the funniest scenes in the series, but it is so for all the wrong reasons. Let's talk about the Pneuma and Nia shit for a bit. I think Pneuma is a really interesting subversion of the antitype, since she is one to take the role of the split personality entity instead of the main character, but I absolutely hate how the ending makes Pyra and Mithra two separate entities. The way the cut dialogue for the ending reads to me is that originally they were going to reset both of them and keep Nia as the actual antitype, but for whatever reason they decided not to do that, which I find to be a decision for the worse. Nia in general is a character that needed much more spotlight. Instead they relegated her to what is essentially this game's Melia. Though unlike Melia, she actually got to bang the guy she likes. But man, those final few chapters of Blade 2 are so fucking good. The signs that Elysium is not really all it's made out to be are there from the start, but actually climbing the orbital elevator and reaching that deserted wasteland is far and away one of that game's best moments. And some of the character moments in the endgame are genuinely really strong. So why the fuck does it take the game so long to get there? And lastly, before we move on to connecting everything, let me complain about Blade 3's endgame for a bit, alright? Yes, the story really does end up suffering a lot towards the end, there's no denying that. Take the consoles for instance. They are literally just the testaments from Xenosaga, but because there are so many of them, only a small handful of them actually get to have any relevance whatsoever, with most of them serving as little more than cannon fodder for hero quests. And the heroes, man, none of them fucking matter. The game generally has this issue where it equates quality to quantity, when in actuality characters like the testaments only work because there were only a handful of them. And man, I just hate the power of friendship bullshit they pull in the final fight. Yes, it's cinematically really cool, but it's also extremely infuriating, because I know that the series can do better, it has in the past, and yet all of this is juxtaposed with some extremely heartfelt scenes throughout the first 5 chapters. Maybe it's because of my personal experiences making me biased, but that maternity ward scene was extremely heartwarming. And the scenes at the end of chapter 5 are some of the best we've had in the series since Saga. And that is saying a lot. But let's get back to what I said during the Blade 3 segment again, about how this is basically a legally distinct Gears reimagining. Having played one before the other immediately clues you in to a lot of the game's plot points, but whereas playing Blade 3 first leads to an awkward experience, playing Gears first lets you really appreciate what the game is actually going for. The imagery of an Ouroborus, the snake eating its own tail, is something extremely prevalent throughout all of the franchise, but nowhere is it near as prominent as in Blade 3. It's symbolic of a self-destructive eternal cycle, and so I think making the story resemble that of Gears so closely was symbolic. Many people expected this to be the last game in the Perfect Work series, and I honestly cannot think of a way to cap it all off better than to have it all loop back around to the beginning. And then we add Future Redeemed into the equation, and everything just falls into place. It doesn't just finalize the cycle, it breaks it. From this point onward, everything is unclear. I have come to believe that everything that this series has ultimately built up to was planned ahead since, at the very least, the finalization of Xenoblade 2. And this leads us to the final section of this video series. The one where I frantically try to connect every single game in the franchise, try to make sense of everything we have seen so far, and finally attempt to create a cohesive timeline of everything. If you've still not played Gears, gone through all of Saga, and played all of Blade, and are for whatever reason still watching this video, then this is your last chance to drop out, because from this point onwards, we are going to explore what has been responsible for my steadily declining sanity these past 4 months. Dragon Ball Z. I still can't believe that I finally get to say this. I've been waiting for 4 months, but here goes nothing. I can't believe these games took place in Canada all along. Not only are Xenosaga, Xenoblade, and Xenoblade X canon, but by extension, Gears as well. I'll explain in a bit. This knowledge is what really allows us to recontextualize everything we know. So let's first run through the top before I try to make a timeline out of it. Let's start with Zanza. I believe that his role as a villain serves as an intentional inversion of Wilhelm. Whereas Wilhelm was trying to recreate the world in order to maintain some higher order, Klaus wanted to become its god. In turn, Alvis serves as Chaos's role in trying to break that cycle. And then we have the Fog Beasts and Future Redeemed. Since they're functionally identical, and we now know that Blade 1 and Blade 2 take place on Lost Jerusalem, it's fair to say that they are Gnosis. Xenoblade X is where the connections start to become loose, however. I think we can work around this though. So we know that the human database is essentially like the UMN, which is also what Origin uses as its base in Blade 3. But at the same time, X claims that wars with aliens were prevalent even before the destruction of the Earth. Saga, on the other hand, states that no alien life was ever discovered. Because of this, I'm willing to believe that the government in Blade X lied about a lot of things, including the aliens, and I also think that Mirror itself isn't a real planet. I think all of it is a fake reality instead of the UMN, where the data of all humans is endlessly repeated up until the moment of the database's destruction, which is how Lau ended up coming back. At the same time, the Black Knight is clearly a fucking testament, and since we know Wilhelm can freely fuck around with the UMN, it isn't far-fetched to think that he might have dispatched someone to check in on that simulated reality. And then there's Blade 3. I think the 3 original Möbius, X, Y, and Z are all based on the prior Xeno antagonists and represent a different form of the endless cycle throughout the series. X is Wilhelm and represents the idea of self-destruction and recreation from the point of origin. Y is Krelian and represents the idea of death and rebirth at the point of death. And lastly, Z is Zanza, who stands by the idea of keeping everything locked in a single eternal moment, similarly to how the Bionis and the Mechonis were locked in an eternal battle even after death. And then there's Future Redeemed, where all of this information is given to us, thanks to the fucking radio. We now know that, to some extent, Xenoblade X is canon, it must be. At the same time, we also know that Dmitry Yuriev has been around since the time of Lost Jerusalem, meaning that he's been jumping through bodies for far longer than we originally believed. And the entire fucking series took place in Canada. Toronto. Origin and the UMN are one and the same. Many people, myself included, believed for the longest time that Gears, Saga, Blade, and Blade X took place in 4 separate universes. But as it turns out, that's completely fucking wrong. That's why the characters in Torna can't be grouped into the archetypes properly. That's why Future Redeemed has multiple contexts. That's why the Trinity processor runs off of fucking Zohar emulators. There is so much overlap between every single game in the series that I cannot possibly list them all. Instead, I've linked the site in the description cataloging an insane amount of recurring imagery and themes throughout the franchise. Give it a read sometime. Maybe I'll even make a video on it. Some of these things are completely absurd, I'll admit, but a lot of it does ring true. With that said, let's get to making a cohesive timeline. We start off with Xenogears. Everything goes exactly as told in Perfect Works and the Saga Free guides. The Zohar was discovered by T. Mazda in 20XX. In 2XXX, Grimoire Verum starts doing the first experiments in Toronto. Dmitry Yuriev is currently aligned with the Salvatore faction, and Wilhelm is already CEO of Vector. This is also when the first incarnation of Evil appears and makes contact with Nephilim. During one of the experiments, Nephilim vanishes. Around the same time, a different team of scientists led by Klaus also conduct their experiments on the Zohar aboard the first orbital space station. They do a phase transfer experiment and shit goes wrong. The Earth gets split in 2 and disappears. Abel disappears. The Salvatore faction uses their fleet to escape. At the same time, one of the fleets, the White Whale, also flees, but is somehow trapped in the phase transfer and ends up on an artificial planet inside of the UMN. We can assume that the entirety of Xenoblade X takes place at this point in time, with a big part of what everyone believes to have happened there being a bunch of bullshit made up by the government. In 2510, Transcended Christ was adopted, and in TC16, Earth was renamed to Lost Jerusalem, as Wilhelm seals its location away. Everything stays the same up until 4767. One must consider that Omega and Deus are one and the same. Something to note here is that in this timeline, the Eldritch is entirely man-made. Deus goes out of control, Abel reappears and becomes the original contact, becoming a full extension of Udu, aka the Wave Existence. The Eldritch crashes, and everything goes exactly as we see in Xenogears. The timeline takes its predetermined course, and Wilhelm calls upon the eternal recurrence. We don't know how many times his cycle is repeated, but judging from how Yeshua speaks, it's likely that it happened at the very least twice. On the X cycle, we reach the Saga version of events. Everything is the same, except that the Eldritch here is Abel's arc. After the disappearance of the Earth, the planet reappears as 2 split worlds, the world of the Bionis and Mechonis, and the destroyed remains of Canada. Klaus feels bad, so he turns it into Alrest by using the Zohar emulators of the Trinity processor as a base. After this, the events of the Blade series take place on Lost Jerusalem. First Torna. Sometime after this we reach TC 4667, and Pipe Piper takes place. Then some 50 years after that, Blade 1 and Blade 2 take place, and then simultaneously. Then Future Connected. An unspecified amount of time later, the worlds attempt to merge, Origin gets fucked over by Zed, and the Future Redeemed happens. Some years after this, we reach 4767 again, but this time there's a major difference. Yeshua decides to actually get involved once, and this changes the entire course of the timeline. All of Xenosaga until Missing Year happens. Then 6 months later, Xenoblade 3 and Saga 3 take place simultaneously. During the ending of Saga 3, Yeshua, Nephilim, and Mary destroy the UMN, and the Sealon Yost Jerusalem. Because of the last few gates remaining, the worlds in Blade 3 finally merge as originally intended, and Earth is finally complete again. During this, KOS-MOS' broken body is guided by Yeshua towards the location of Lost Jerusalem, and shortly after its unification, she arrives, as we see in the post-credits to Future Redeemed. All of this played to a beautiful song composed by Mitsuda, with the same instruments he used all the way back in 1998 for Small Tube of Pieces, with Juan Hogg singing the lyrics written by Takahashi himself. And much like Maybe Tomorrow, it once again centers around the uncertainty of the future. However, this time it's different. This time it's not just the in-universe future that's uncertain, but the future of the entire franchise. Future Redeemed marks the end of Perfect Works as we know it. The series is no longer bound by the same structure it's been following since 1998. From here on, Team is free to do whatever the hell they want. Whatever comes next is completely uncharted territory. Maybe we'll see a war about the repopulation of Earth. Maybe the cast of Blade 3 end up meeting Shion and Junior, and maybe the remnants of the UMN have planned just one final surprise. I don't know, but you know what? I've never been more excited about being uncertain about the future, because to me, that's what Xeno is all about. It's a franchise where the core message has consistently been to move on from what's keeping us tied to the past, and for the longest time I was of the opinion that it is extremely ironic. After all, Tetsuya Takahashi seems to be incapable of doing so, considering every game he makes ultimately just leads back to Xenogears, but I don't think that's entirely true anymore. If anything else, Future Redeemed has proved that even he is ready to move on, and it doesn't matter what comes next for the franchise. You can bet your ass that I'll be there to see it through, no matter what. And thus concludes my all-inclusive deep dive into the Xeno meta franchise. Across all of its ups and downs, I am ultimately very happy that I was able to follow this franchise in the way that I did, and I really don't think I can call it anything other than one of my all-time favorites, because I can confidently say that even at its worst, this series is able to make me get invested, even if just for a short while. So with all of that said, I thank all of you for watching these videos to the very end. Cheers, and do me a favor here, have a wonderful morning, day, evening, or night.
Don't cry, little Xenoblade fan. Uncle Monolith has enough Xenosaga imagery to feed you your entire life. Takahashi! Get the Zohar! The boy's hungry!